Hello everyone and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Sarah McKinnon, and I used to think the scariest thing about my job was grading undergraduate papers. I'm a folklore researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, which means I spend most of my time reading old stories and trying to figure out what's true and what's just mountain talk. But 3 years ago, I learned that some stories are true in ways that'll make you wish they weren't. It started with my great-grandmother's diary. When my mom died, I found it tucked inside an old Bible. The last entry was from December 1932. The hunger is calling me back to the hollow. God forgive me for what I might do. She disappeared that winter. The family always said she got lost in a blizzard, but reading those words made my skin crawl. I decided to make it my research project, Appalachian cannibalism during the Great Depression. There were more stories than people wanted to admit. Families going hungry, doing things that desperate people do. At least, that's what I told myself it was. The Monongahela National Forest records had 3 separate incidents near Seneca Rocks between 1891 and 1987. Each time, people vanished during harsh winters. When they were found, the survivors showed signs of, well, let's just say they'd done what they had to do to stay alive. The area locals called it Hunger Hollow, and most folks avoided it entirely. I put together a small research team, 3 graduate students who needed the fieldwork credits. Marcus handled our equipment, Lisa knew more about mountain culture than anyone, and David documented everything with his camera. We planned a week-long trip to interview locals and map the historical sites. Our guide was Ezra Blackwood, a weathered man in his 60s who'd lived in those mountains his whole life. When I called him about the job, there was a long pause after I mentioned Hunger Hollow. "You sure you want to go there, miss?" His voice sounded tired, like he'd had this conversation before. "It's just research," I said. "We're documenting oral histories." Another pause. Some histories are better left buried. But he agreed to take us, with one condition. We'd leave if he said to leave, no questions asked. I thought he was just being overly cautious about city folks in the wilderness. I was wrong about a lot of things. We drove out on a gray December morning in 1990. The weather report called for snow, but nothing too serious. Just a typical Appalachian winter. The road to our base camp wound through thick pine forests, getting narrower and more rutted with each mile. By the time we reached the old logging road that led to Hunger Hollow, Marcus had to put chains on our tires. "Cell towers don't reach out here," Ezra warned us as we unloaded our gear. "Radio might work on high ground, but don't count on it." The hollow stretched out below us like a wound in the earth. Steep ridges on both sides, thick with bare trees that looked like skeleton fingers against the gray sky. At the bottom, maybe half a mile away, I could see the remains of old homesteads, collapsed roofs and stone chimneys poking through the snow. That's where the Hartwell family lived. Ezra pointed to the largest ruin. Back in 1891. Even from a distance, something felt wrong about the place. The snow looked different down there, not as white somehow. And I couldn't hear any birds, which was strange because the forest around us was full of winter sounds. We made camp on a flat spot about halfway down the ridge, close enough to explore but not right in the hollow itself. As we set up our tents, I noticed Lisa shivering more than the temperature called for. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, but her eyes kept drifting toward the ruins below. There's something sad about this place, you know? Like it's still morning. David was taking photos of everything, but when he tried to get shots of the hollow itself, he kept having problems. His camera would focus on everything except the buildings. "Weird light down there," he muttered. "Keeps playing tricks with the lens." That first night, we sat around our camp stove eating freeze-dried pasta and listening to Ezra tell stories. But when I asked about the Hartwell family, he went quiet. "Some stories shouldn't be told in the dark," he said finally. "Wait for morning." I should have listened to him about that too. The next morning dawned gray and still, the kind of quiet that makes you whisper even when there's no reason to be quiet. Over coffee and instant oatmeal, Ezra finally told us about the Hartwells. Winter of 1891 was the worst anyone could remember, he began, staring into his steaming cup. Snow started in October and didn't stop till March. The Hartwell family, mother, father, 4 children, they got cut off from everyone else when a blizzard blocked the only road out. He paused, took a sip. My grandfather was just a boy then, but he remembered. Said the hunger got into them sometime around Christmas. Not regular hunger, something else. Something that twisted them up inside. "What do you mean?" Lisa asked. "They started eating things they shouldn't have. Tree bark, leather boots, dirt. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough." His eyes got distant. My grandfather saw the youngest boy in the woods once, gnawing on his own arm like it was a chicken leg, blood running down his chin, but he was smiling. Marcus laughed nervously. "Come on, that's just old mountain stories." Ezra looked at him with those tired eyes. "Boy, I've lived in these mountains for 66 years. I know the difference between stories and truth." After breakfast, we hiked down to the Hartwell ruins. The closer we got, the quieter it became. Even our footsteps seemed muffled by something more than just snow. When we reached what had been the main house, David started taking pictures while Lisa and I poked around the foundation stones. That's when Marcus found the first one. "Hey, come look at this," he called from near what had been the back door. He was crouched down, brushing snow away from something. "Is this what I think it is?" I walked over and immediately wished I hadn't. Embedded in the old wooden door frame was a human tooth, not fallen out, driven in like someone had hammered it there on purpose. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it had been filed to a point. "Jesus," David whispered, taking photos. "How old do you think that is?" I was about to answer when Lisa screamed. We all turned to see her standing at the edge of what had been the cellar. She was pointing down into the darkness with a shaking hand. "There's something down there," she whispered. "Something moving." Ezra was the first to reach her. He looked down into the cellar and went very still. Then he slowly backed away. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "Right now." "What did you see?" I asked. He shook his head. "Some things you don't talk about in daylight either." But Marcus was already pulling out his flashlight, leaning over the edge. "It's probably just an animal, maybe a bear hibernating." The beam of his light cut through the darkness below. For a moment, all we could see were stone walls and debris. Then the light hit something that made us all step back. Bones. Lots of bones. Arranged in careful patterns on the cellar floor, like someone had been decorating with them. But they were old bones. So old, they looked more like yellow sticks than anything that had ever been inside a person. And in the center of it all, a small pile of fresher bones. Whiter. Cleaner. "Marcus," I said carefully, "step away from there." but he was leaning further in, trying to get a better look. "I think I can see—" "Wait, what's that?" The bones in the center of the pattern moved, not like something was disturbing them from underneath. They just moved, shifting and rearranging themselves with soft clicking sounds that echoed up from the cellar, like fingers tapping on a table, if the fingers were made of old death. Marcus dropped his flashlight. It fell into the cellar and went out, leaving us all staring into darkness that suddenly seemed much deeper. "Run," Ezra said. We ran. Back up the ridge to our camp, stumbling through snow, not talking, just moving as fast as we could. It wasn't until we reached our tents that anyone spoke. "What the hell was that?" David gasped. Ezra was already breaking down his gear, something that should have stayed buried. "But what was moving the bones?" Lisa asked. "Don't matter," Ezra replied. "What matters is we're leaving before dark." I wanted to argue. This was exactly the kind of evidence I'd come looking for. But something about the way those bones had moved, like they were alive, like they were hungry. "One more day," I said, "just to document what we found." Ezra looked at me like I'd suggested jumping off a cliff. "Miss, I've been keeping people away from this place for 40 years. There's a reason for that." "What reason?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the hollow. Then he said, "Because some hungers never die. They just wait." As if to prove his point, something howled from down below, long and mournful, like a person crying. But no person had ever made a sound like that. We decided to stay one more night. That evening, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. By the time we'd eaten dinner, our breath was coming out in thick white clouds, and the zipper on my tent was already starting to freeze. "Weather Service didn't predict this," Marcus said, checking his radio. All he got was static. Ezra was quiet through dinner, staring down at the hollow. The ruins were barely visible in the growing darkness, but I could swear I saw lights moving between them. Small, flickering lights like candles. "Ezra," I said, "are there other people down there?" He looked where I was pointing. The lights danced for a moment, then disappeared. "No," he said, "no people." Around midnight I was awakened by a sound I couldn't identify. Scratching, like fingernails on wood, but rhythmic, deliberate. It was coming from outside my tent. I unzipped the flap carefully and peered out. The scratching stopped immediately, but I could see fresh marks in the snow around our camp. Not animal tracks. Marks like someone had been dragging their fingernails through the snow in long, wavy lines. A few minutes later, Marcus started screaming. We all rushed to his tent. He was sitting up in his sleeping bag, eyes wide, pointing at the tent wall. "Something was touching me," he gasped, through the tent, like fingers pressing against my back. David aimed his flashlight at the tent wall. There were indentations in the fabric, like someone had been poking it from outside. But when we checked, there were no footprints in the snow around his tent. The indentations were too high off the ground for someone standing to have made them. "Maybe it was a branch," Lisa suggested, but her voice shook. "Branches don't have fingers," Marcus said. We decided to take turns keeping watch. I volunteered for the first shift, mostly because I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep anyway. I sat in the middle of our camp with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee, listening to the wind in the trees. At 2 in the morning, the wind stopped. Just like that. One moment the pines were swaying and creaking, the next everything was perfectly still. The silence was so complete it hurt my ears. Even my breathing seemed too loud. That's when I heard the voice. "Sarah." It was barely a whisper, coming from the direction of the hollow. A woman's voice, old and tired. "Sarah, child." I knew that voice. I'd heard it in family recordings, on old cassette tapes my grandmother had made. It was my great-grandmother's voice. "Come down to me, child. I've been waiting so long." I stood up without meaning to. My feet started moving toward the edge of our camp, toward the hollow. Part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that my great-grandmother had been dead for 60 years. But her voice was so real, so familiar. "Sarah, I'm so hungry. Help me, child. Help your old granny." I was halfway down the ridge before I realized what I was doing. The cold bit through my clothes, but I barely felt it. Below me, I could see those lights again, flickering between the ruins. They looked warmer now, welcoming. "That's it, child. Come to Granny." I might have kept walking all the way down if Ezra hadn't grabbed my arm. "Don't listen," he said firmly. "It ain't her." The voice changed immediately, becoming angry. "Let her go, old man. She belongs to us now." "No," Ezra said, pulling me back toward camp. "She don't belong to nobody." The voice laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Her blood calls to us, mountain man. You can't fight blood." Back at camp, the others were awake and packing frantically. "We heard you talking to someone," David said, "but there was no one there." "I heard my great-grandmother," I said, still shaking. "She was calling me." Lisa stopped packing. "Your great-grandmother? The one who disappeared?" When I nodded, she went very pale. "Sarah, you told us she vanished in 1932. That was the last time anyone reported strange activity in this hollow. What if she never left?" Marcus had his radio out, frantically trying to raise someone. "Come in, base camp. Come in, anyone. We need immediate evacuation from Hunger Hollow." Nothing but static. "Storm must be interfering," he said, but we could all see the sky, clear and full of stars. Ezra was standing at the edge of our camp, looking down at the hollow. "It's too late," he said quietly. "They know you're here now. They won't let you leave." "What won't let us leave?" I demanded. He turned to face us, and in the flashlight beam, his face looked ancient. "The hungry ones, the ones who never stopped eating." As if to prove his point, we heard movement in the forest around us. Not one thing, many things moving through the trees, getting closer. "What do they want?" Lisa whispered. Ezra looked at me with something that might have been pity. "They want you to join the family." That's when we saw the first one. It came out of the tree line like a pale shadow, moving wrong, like its joints bent in places they shouldn't. In the flashlight beam, I could see it had been human once. But its arms were too long, its fingers stretched out like claws, and its mouth was full of too many teeth. All of them sharp, all of them hungry. "Run," Ezra whispered. This time we listened. We scattered in different directions, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. I lost track of the others almost immediately, crashing through the dark forest with my flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of me. Behind me, I could hear them following, not just one anymore, but several, moving through the trees with sounds like breaking branches and scraping bone. I don't know how long I ran before I realized I was heading downhill, toward the hollow, toward the ruins where this had all started. My great-grandmother's voice drifted through the trees again, closer now. "Don't run from me, child. I've been alone so long." I stumbled into a clearing and found myself face to face with the Hartwell house. Up close, it looked different than it had that morning, less ruined. The roof was still mostly intact, and warm yellow light flickered in the windows. "Come inside, Sarah. Come meet your family." I backed away, but something grabbed my ankle. I looked down and screamed. A hand had pushed up through the snow, gray skin stretched tight over bones, fingernails grown long and yellow. It held me with impossible strength, while more hands burst through the ground around me. "Welcome home," my great-grandmother's voice said, and I saw her. She stood in the doorway of the house wearing the same dress from the old family photos. But she was wrong, all wrong. Too thin, like someone had stretched her out. Her eyes were black holes in her skull, and when she smiled, I saw why she'd filed her teeth to points. "I've been waiting for you to come back to us," she said. "Waiting and starving for so long." The hands pulling at me weren't trying to drag me down. They were trying to pull me toward the house, toward her. "What happened to you?" I gasped, struggling against the grip. She laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "I got hungry, child, hungrier than you can imagine. And when you're hungry enough, really truly hungry, you'll eat anything, even yourself." That's when I saw the truth of it. Her arms were covered in old bite marks, healed scars where she'd been gnawing on herself for 60 years. Parts of her were missing, chunks of flesh torn away and never grown back. "But family tastes better," she continued. "Fresh family with warm blood and young meat." The hands were stronger now, more of them pushing through the snow. I recognized some of the faces attached to them. The Hartwell family, still trying to satisfy a hunger that would never end. "Let me go," I screamed. "Can't do that, child. You're kin. You belong with us." Something crashed through the trees behind me. Marcus stumbled into the clearing, his clothes torn, bleeding from scratches on his face and arms. "Sarah," he yelled, "get away from there." But he wasn't looking at my great-grandmother. He was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, like I was food. "Marcus, what's wrong with you?" He took a step toward me, and I saw his teeth, still human, but he'd been trying to sharpen them. His lips were bloody from the attempt. "I'm so hungry, Sarah," he said, "hungrier than I've ever been in my life, and you smell so good." My great-grandmother clapped her hands together with delight. "Oh, wonderful! The hunger is spreading already. Soon you'll all be family." Marcus was getting closer. The hands from the ground had let go of me. They didn't need to hold me anymore. I was surrounded. Marcus in front, my great-grandmother behind, and the hungry dead crawling up from their graves on all sides. "This isn't real," I said. "Hunger can't be supernatural. It's just desperation." "Is it?" my great-grandmother asked. "Tell me, child, are you hungry?" The moment she said it, I realized I was. Starving, actually. When was the last time I'd eaten? This morning? Yesterday? I couldn't remember, and suddenly it seemed like the most important thing in the world. My stomach cramped with emptiness. My mouth watered, and Marcus, standing there bleeding from all those scratches, looked absolutely delicious. "No," I said out loud. "This isn't me. It's who you've always been," my great-grandmother said gently. "Who we've all always been, deep down. When you're hungry enough, civilized just becomes a word." Marcus lunged at me then, fingernails clawing at my arms. I barely managed to dodge, and he crashed into one of the dead things rising from the snow. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, biting and tearing at each other. I ran for the house. It sounds crazy, running toward the thing that wanted to eat me. But it was the only structure standing, the only place that might have something I could use as a weapon. And besides, I was so hungry now that thinking straight was getting harder by the second. Inside, the house was wrong. The walls were covered with carved symbols, the same ones Ezra had mentioned seeing on trees. But these weren't carved into wood. They were carved into bone, human bone, built right into the walls like decorations. My great-grandmother followed me inside, moving like she was floating just above the floor. "Do you like what we've done with the place?" she asked. "Every bone tells a story. Every story is about hunger." In the center of the main room was a table. On the table was a feast: roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables that looked like they'd just been picked from a garden. My mouth watered so much I almost choked. "Sit," she said. "Eat. Join us." I was so hungry, hungrier than I'd ever been in my life. The smell of the food was making me dizzy. All I had to do was sit down, take one bite, and the terrible empty feeling in my stomach would go away. "What's the catch?" I asked. She smiled with those pointed teeth. "Once you eat with us, you become us. The hunger never stops, but at least you'll have family to share it with." Through the window, I could see Marcus and the thing from the grave still fighting. But they weren't trying to hurt each other anymore. They were trying to see who got to eat the other one first. "And if I don't eat? Then you starve to death. Right here, right now. The hunger will eat you from the inside out until there's nothing left but bones and the need for more." I was so hungry I could barely stand. My vision was starting to blur around the edges. But something my grandmother had always told me echoed in my mind. "Nothing good comes free, Sarah, especially in these mountains." "There's a third option," I said. My great-grandmother tilted her head like a curious bird. "Oh?" I looked around the room again. All those bones built into the walls, all those stories of hunger. And I remembered something Ezra had said. Some hungers never die. They just wait. "You're not just hungry," I said. "You're the hunger itself. You're what's been making people do this for 100 years. Her smile faltered slightly. "And if I destroy this place, I destroy you." Now she wasn't smiling at all. "You can't destroy hunger, child. Hunger is part of being human." "Maybe," I said, "but you're not human anymore." I grabbed the oil lamp from the table and threw it against the wall of bones. The house went up like it was made of paper. The fire spread impossibly fast, like it had been waiting all these years for something to burn. My great-grandmother screamed, not with her voice, but with the voices of everyone who'd ever starved to death in these mountains. The sound shattered the windows and made my ears bleed. I ran outside as the flames reached the roof. Marcus was standing in the clearing, looking around like he'd just woken up from a dream. "Sarah, what happened? Why am I so hungry?" The things crawling out of the ground were disappearing, sinking back into the snow like they'd never been there at all. But the fire was real enough. It lit up the whole hollow like daylight. "Where are David and Lisa?" I asked. "We found them at our old campsite, unconscious but breathing." Lisa woke up first, confused and asking for food. David had hypothermia but no memory of how he'd gotten separated from us. Ezra found us at dawn, leading a search and rescue team up from the main road. "Saw the fire from town," he said, but his eyes told a different story. "Figured you might need help." The official report blamed everything on exposure and hypothermia-induced hallucinations. The fire was listed as an accident caused by faulty camping equipment. Marcus and Lisa recovered fully, though neither of them ever wanted to talk about what happened that night. David's photographs came out mostly blank, just a few shots of empty forest and shadows. But I know what really happened. And so does Ezra. "It's over?" I asked him as we drove away from the hollow. "For now," he said. But these mountains have long memories. And hunger always finds a way to come back. He was right about that. It's been 3 years since Hunger Hollow, and I still can't eat a full meal. Not because I'm not hungry, I'm always hungry now, but because I'm afraid that if I eat too much, I might not be able to stop. The hunger that got into me that night never completely went away. I've changed my research focus to supernatural starvation phenomena. There are more cases than you'd think, scattered all over the world. Places where hunger became something else, something that could spread from person to person like a disease. I'm documenting them all, mapping them, trying to understand the pattern, because I know that what we destroyed in that hollow wasn't unique. It was just one branch of something bigger, something that's been feeding on human desperation for thousands of years. Sometimes, on particularly bad nights, I still hear my great-grandmother's voice, not calling me back to the hollow. That place is ash and empty now, but reminding me that I carry her blood, her legacy, her hunger, and someday, when I'm old and desperate enough, I might listen. The local families still avoid that part of the forest. They leave food offerings at the tree line sometimes, just in case, because they understand something that most people don't. Some hungers are older than civilization, deeper than instinct, and they're always waiting for the next winter to be just a little too cold, the next harvest to come up just a little too short, the next person to get just a little too hungry to remember what makes them human. My name is Sarah McKinnon, and I used to think the scariest thing about my job was grading undergraduate papers. I was wrong about that too. My name is Dr. Michael Ashford, and I'm a psychiatrist. I help people with their minds when they get sick or scared. Most of the time I work in big hospitals in the city, but sometimes I get sent to small towns where strange things happen to lots of people all at once. In October 1995, I got a call that would change my life forever. The state health department needed me to go to a tiny mountain town in North Carolina called Raven's Roost. Only about 400 people lived there, way up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the roads wind like snakes and cell phones don't work. The problem was scary. 12 people had been taken to the hospital in the past 2 weeks. All of them were seeing the same thing that wasn't really there. They all talked about a bone woman who came to them at night. The doctors in the big city hospital didn't know what to do. That's why they called me. I packed my bags and drove up into the mountains on a gray autumn day. The leaves were turning red and gold, but something felt wrong. The air was too quiet. Even the birds seemed afraid to sing. Raven's Roost sat on top of a long, narrow ridge that the old Cherokee people used to call Devil's Backbone. I could see why. The mountain looked like the spine of some giant monster buried in the earth. The town spread along this ridge like beads on a string. A few stores, a gas station, some houses, and not much else. Sheriff Janet Crowley met me at the small police station. She was a tough-looking woman about 45 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes. Her family had been keeping law and order in these mountains for 3 generations. "Doctor," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "I've seen a lot of strange things in my time, but nothing like this. These folks aren't crazy. They're scared out of their minds." She drove me to the hospital to see the patients. The building was small and old, but clean. In the psychiatric ward, I found 12 people who all told me the same impossible story. "She comes at night," whispered Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who ran the town's only bakery. All bones and charred skin. Her eyes burn like coals. She stands at the foot of my bed and points at me with a finger that's nothing but bone. Mr. Jenkins, the mailman, had the same story. So did Sarah Chen. the new teacher who'd moved to town just 6 months ago. So did 10 others. All different ages, different backgrounds, but they all described the exact same woman made of burnt bones and fire. What scared me most was how sure they were. These weren't confused, sick people. They spoke clearly and looked right at me. They truly believed they had seen this bone woman. Some even had small burns on their hands that the doctors couldn't explain. The construction started 2 weeks ago, Sheriff Crowley told me as we walked back to her car. Right when all this began, they're putting up a new cell phone tower on the highest part of the ridge. Had to dig deep to set the rear foundation. She pointed up the mountain to where I could see construction equipment and workers in hard hats. The Cherokee elder came by last week. Old man named Joseph Crow Feather. Said we were disturbing sacred ground. Said this ridge was where his people brought criminals to die a long, long time ago. That night I stayed in the town's only motel. It was small and old, with thin walls and a view of the mountains. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept thinking about those 12 people and their identical stories. Around midnight, I woke up feeling too hot. The room felt like an oven, even though it was October and cold outside. I got up to check the heater, but it was turned off. The heat seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then I heard it, a sound like someone walking on the roof. Slow, heavy steps, back and forth, back and forth. I looked out the window but saw nothing. The steps stopped, and the room slowly got cool again. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went to the town's small library to learn about Raven's Roost. The librarian was a sweet old lady named Mrs. Henderson, who had lived here her whole life. Her great-grandmother had been one of the first settlers. "You're asking about the bone woman," she said quietly, looking around to make sure no one else could hear. "This isn't the first time she's been seen." She led me to a back room filled with old books and papers. From a locked cabinet, she pulled out a thick folder of newspaper clippings and handwritten journals. 1878, she said, opening to a yellowed newspaper page. The Asheville Times. Witch burned in mountain justice. I read the story with growing horror. A woman named Magdalena Thorne had been accused of being a witch. The crops had failed that year, and many animals had died from sickness. The townspeople blamed her because she was different. She lived alone, knew about herbs and healing, and had no husband or children. They tied her to a post on the highest point of the ridge and burned her alive. My great-grandmother wrote about it in her diary, Mrs. Henderson said, showing me pages of faded handwriting. She said Magdalena screamed curses as she burned, said she'd come back to make them pay for their sin. But there was more. As I read through the old papers, I found proof that Magdalena Thorne wasn't a witch at all. She was a midwife and healer who helped deliver babies and cure the sick. The real reason the crops failed was a drought, and the animals died from a disease that spread through the whole region that year. The people of Raven's Roost had murdered an innocent woman. "The construction," I said suddenly. "They're digging right where she was burned, aren't they?" Mrs. Henderson nodded sadly. "Same spot. The old-timers tried to warn them, but nobody listens to old stories anymore." That afternoon, I visited the construction site. The workers were taking a break, sitting in the shade and drinking water. The foreman, a big man named Dave Miller, looked worried. "Strange things been happening," he told me. "Tools keep getting too hot to hold, even in the shade. Yesterday, Jimmy's gloves caught fire while he was holding a metal pipe. No reason for it. The pipe wasn't near any heat source." He showed me where they had been digging. It was a deep hole, maybe 10 feet across. At the bottom, I could see pieces of old metal and what looked like charred wood. Found bones down there too, Dave said quietly. Human bones. Police told us to keep working, but the boys are getting spooked. 2 of them quit yesterday after they said they saw a woman made of fire standing right where you're standing now. As if on cue, the temperature around us suddenly jumped. It felt like standing next to a big campfire. The workers all stepped back, looking around nervously. It's starting, one of them whispered. She don't like us being here. That night I got a call from Sheriff Crowley. Her voice was tight with fear. Doctor, you need to come quick. We got another one, but this time it's different. I drove to a farmhouse on the edge of town. Ambulance lights flashed red and blue in the darkness. Inside I found Billy Morrison, a teenager who worked part-time at the gas station. He was conscious but in shock, staring at something only he could see. His mother, Mrs. Morrison, was crying. He was doing homework in his room when he started screaming. When I got there, he was standing in the corner, looking at his desk. His books were on fire but not burning up, just flames coming out of them, but the paper wasn't turning black. Billy looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. She was right there, he whispered. The bone woman. She touched my books and they caught fire. But it was cold fire, Doctor. Cold as ice but bright as the sun. She looked right at me and said, "Tell them I'm coming for what they owe." The strangest part was Billy's hands. They had burn marks, but not from regular fire. These burns looked old, like scars that had been there for years. When I touched them, they felt cold instead of hot. "This is impossible," I told Sheriff Crowley as we stood outside the house. "Mass hallucinations don't work this way. People can't share the exact same detailed vision and have physical proof." She looked up at the mountain where the construction site sat. "Maybe it's not a hallucination, Doctor. Maybe we really did dig up something that should have stayed buried." As we talked, I felt someone watching us. I turned toward the tree line and saw her. A woman made of charred bones and flickering flames stood between 2 pine trees. She was tall and thin, with long black hair that moved like smoke. Her eyes were holes in her skull, but they glowed with red light. She wore the burned remains of a simple dress. She raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at me. Her mouth opened, and even from 50 feet away, I heard her voice like wind through dry leaves. "Tell them the truth. Tell them what they did. Tell them I remember every face, every name, every lie." Then she was gone, leaving only the smell of smoke and burning wood. Sheriff Crowley grabbed my arm. "Please tell me you saw that too." "I saw her," I said, my voice shaking. "God help me, I saw her." The next few days were like living in a nightmare that kept getting worse. More people started seeing the bone woman. The construction workers refused to go back to the site. 3 more families packed up and left town, too scared to stay. I spent hours interviewing the affected people, trying to find some logical explanation. But the more I learned, the less sense it made. The bone woman appeared to different people at the same time in different places. She could touch things and leave burn marks, but regular fire couldn't hurt her. She spoke in a voice that sounded like wind and crackling flames. The worst part was the pattern I started to notice. Every person who saw her was connected to the original families who had lived in Raven's Roost in 1878. The descendants of the people who had burned Magdalena Thorne were being visited by her spirit. "She's coming for the bloodlines," old Joseph Crowfeather told me when I finally tracked him down at the Cherokee Reservation. He was a small, weathered man in his 80s with kind eyes and hands covered in liver spots. "My grandfather told me about that night," he said, pouring me coffee in his small kitchen. The white settlers came to our village, asking for help with their witch problem. My grandfather refused. He said the woman they accused was a healer, not a curse-bringer. Joseph showed me a map drawn on deer hide, passed down through his family. It showed the ridge where Raven's Roost now sat. "We called it where the innocent died," he said, tracing the ridgeline with his finger. "After they burned her, the Cherokee avoided this place. We knew her spirit would not rest until justice was done." "What kind of justice?" I asked. "Truth," he said simply. "She wants the truth told. She wants her name cleared. She wants them to admit what they did was murder, not justice." But not everyone in town wanted to hear the truth. When I tried to present my findings to the town council, some of the older families got angry. "That's ancient history," snapped Harold Whitman, whose great-great-grandfather had been one of the leaders in the witch trial. "Even if it's true, it's got nothing to do with us. We didn't do anything wrong." "The dead woman doesn't see it that way," I replied. "She's targeting the descendant families specifically. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Jenkins, Billy Morrison. They're all related to people who were there in 1878. "You're talking crazy, Doctor," said Betty Hawkins, another descendant. "Ghosts and spirits and revenge from beyond the grave? This is 1995, not the Dark Ages." That night, Betty Hawkins got her answer. I was staying late at the library, reading through more old records, when Sheriff Crowley called. "Doctor, you need to get to the Hawkins place right now and bring everything you know about fighting fires." I drove through the dark mountain roads as fast as I dared. From 2 miles away, I could see the glow against the sky. But when I got to the Hawkins farm, I found something impossible. The house was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. Flames covered every window and door, climbing up the walls and dancing on the roof. But the wood wasn't turning black. The paint wasn't peeling. It was like the fire was just sitting on top of the house without actually burning it. Betty Hawkins and her family stood in the yard, staring at their home in shock. "It's been like this for an hour," Sheriff Crowley told me. "Fire department can't get close. The flames are too cold. When they tried to spray water on it, the water turned to ice before it hit the house." As we watched, the bone woman appeared on the front porch. She stood in the middle of the cold fire, her skeletal form glowing brighter than the flames around her. She looked directly at Betty Hawkins and spoke in that voice like wind through dead leaves. "Your ancestor held the torch that lit my funeral pyre," she said. "He called me witch and monster while I burned for crimes I never committed. Now his blood will know the cold fire of injustice." Betty stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "What do you want from us? We can't change what happened over 100 years ago." "Truth," the bone woman replied. "Acknowledgement, justice. Let the world know that Magdalena Thorne was innocent. Let them know she was murdered by cowards and liars. And if we do, will you leave us alone?" The bone woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I will consider it." The flames went out all at once, leaving the house completely undamaged. The bone woman disappeared with them. Over the next 2 days, more strange things happened. Livestock started dying on the descendant farms, but not from disease or injury. They were found burned from the inside out, their outsides untouched, but their hearts turned to ash. The construction equipment at the cell tower site kept catching fire. Every time they put out the flames and brought in new machinery, it happened again. The workers finally refused to come back, leaving the half-built tower standing like a metal skeleton against the sky. But the worst thing happened to me. I was sleeping in my motel room when I woke up choking on smoke. The room was filled with flames, but like the Hawkins house, nothing was actually burning. In the middle of the fire stood the bone woman. "You carry the blood of the judge," she said, walking closer to my bed. "Judge Ashford, who sentenced me to death based on lies and fear." My stomach dropped. I had done some research on my family tree as a hobby, but I had never looked back as far as the 1870s. "James Ashford was your ancestor," she continued. "He wore the black robes and called himself Justice while condemning an innocent woman to burn. Your blood carries the stain of his sin." She reached out with one skeletal finger and touched my forehead. Instantly, I was somewhere else. Someone else. I was in a courtroom in 1878, but I was seeing it through Magdalena Thorne's eyes. I felt her fear as the townspeople accused her of witchcraft. I felt her desperation as she tried to explain that she was just a healer. I felt her horror as Judge James Ashford, my own great-great-grandfather, sentenced her to death. And I felt her agony as they tied her to the post and lit the fire. I felt the flames eating her skin, the smoke filling her lungs, the terrible pain of burning alive for crimes she never committed. When the vision ended, I was back in my motel room gasping and crying. The bone woman was gone, but I could still smell smoke and feel the echo of fire on my skin. That's when I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I called Sheriff Crowley and asked her to gather the town council for an emergency meeting. Word spread quickly through Raven's Roost, and by evening, almost the whole town had crowded into the community center. I stood in front of them with boxes of old documents, newspaper clippings, and photographs I had copied from the library and county records office. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "I've spent the past week investigating the supernatural events in your town. I've found the cause, and I've found the solution." I spread out copies of the 1878 newspaper articles and court records on the table in front of me. "Magdalena Thorne was not a witch," I said clearly. "She was a midwife and healer who was murdered by a frightened mob during a time of hardship. The evidence is overwhelming." I showed them medical records proving the crop failures were caused by drought, not curses. I showed them testimonies from neighboring towns about the animal disease that had spread throughout the region that year. I showed them letters from doctors in Asheville who had worked with Magdalena and vouched for her skill and kindness. "The people who killed her knew they were murdering an innocent woman," I continued. "They needed a scapegoat for their troubles, and she was different enough to blame." Harold Whitman stood up angrily. "Even if that's true, it doesn't matter now. We can't bring her back to life or change what happened." "No," I agreed, "but we can acknowledge the truth. We can admit that our ancestors committed murder and clear her name." "Why should we?" Betty Hawkins asked. "What's done is done." That's when Sheriff Crowley stood up. I had asked her to do some research into her own family history, and what she found had shaken her deeply. "Because my great-grandfather led the mob that burned her," she said quietly. "Because Harold's ancestor forged the evidence against her. Because Betty's ancestor held the torch. Because Dr. Ashford's ancestor passed the death sentence." She looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors and friends. "And because she's not going to stop until we make this right." As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the community center suddenly dropped to freezing. Everyone's breath came out in white puffs. The lights flickered and dimmed. The bone woman appeared at the back of the room. This time, she looked different. Larger. More solid. The cold fire that always surrounded her was brighter, and I could feel the anger radiating from her like heat from a stove. 117 years, she said, her voice echoing off the walls. 117 years I have waited for you to speak the truth." She walked down the center aisle, and people scrambled out of her way. With each step, the air got colder and the lights got dimmer. "I was 23 years old when you murdered me," she continued. "I had delivered 37 babies safely into this world. I had healed broken bones and cured fevers. I had never harmed a single living soul." She stopped in front of the table where I had spread out all the evidence of her innocence. "Yet you called me witch and monster. You tied me to a post like an animal and burned me alive while I screamed my innocence." Harold Whitman found his courage and stood up. "That wasn't us. We weren't even born yet." The bone woman turned to face him, and her eye sockets flared with red light. "Blood calls to blood," she said. "Sin passes from generation to generation until justice is done. Your ancestor, Silas Whitman, broke into my cabin and planted cursed objects to use as evidence against me. He knew I was innocent." She pointed at Betty Hawkins. "Your ancestor, Ruth Hawkins, swore she saw me turn into a black cat and fly through her window. She knew she was lying." She pointed at Sheriff Crowley. "Your ancestor, Captain William Crowley, organized the mob and chose the day of execution. He knew there was no real evidence." Finally, she looked at me. "And your ancestor, Judge James Ashford, condemned me to death without allowing me to present witnesses who could prove my innocence. He knew the trial was a sham." The room was silent, except for the sound of people breathing and the crackle of cold flames. "What do you want?" I asked, stepping forward. "Tell us exactly what you want, and we'll do it." The bone woman studied me for a long moment. "I want the truth told. I want my name cleared. I want a marker placed where I died, acknowledging that Magdalena Thorne was innocent of all charges and murdered by an unjust mob." "That's all?" Sheriff Crowley asked. "And I want an apology. From the bloodlines, from the descendants of those who wronged me." Harold Whitman crossed his arms. "I'm not apologizing for something I didn't do." The bone woman raised her hand, and Harold suddenly started choking. He grabbed his throat, his face turning red. "Stop," I shouted. "Magdalena, stop. Hurting innocent people makes you no better than the ones who hurt you." She looked at me, surprised. Then she lowered her hand, and Harold could breathe again. "You are right," she said softly. "I have become the monster they said I was." For the first time, her voice sounded human, sad, tired. "I have waited so long for justice," she continued, "so long in the cold and dark, with only anger to keep me company. I fear I have forgotten how to be anything else." I felt sorry for her then. This woman had died in agony and spent over a century in rage and pain. She deserved peace. "We'll do it," I said, looking around the room. "We'll tell the truth. We'll clear your name. We'll put up a memorial, and those of us whose ancestors wronged you will apologize." "Speak for yourself," Harold muttered. Betty Hawkins stood up. "Harold, shut up." She looked at the bone woman with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry my family lied about you. I'm sorry they helped kill you. I'm sorry you've been suffering all this time." Sheriff Crowley nodded. "I'm sorry too. My ancestor should have protected you instead of leading the mob." I took a deep breath. "And I'm sorry Judge Ashford didn't give you a fair trial. I'm sorry he let fear and prejudice guide his judgment instead of truth and justice." The bone woman looked at Harold Whitman, who was still glaring defiantly. "I can force you," she said quietly. "I can make your life a nightmare until you break, but I would rather you choose to do the right thing." Harold looked around the room at his neighbors, all staring at him. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "Fine," he said. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry my ancestor planted evidence. I'm sorry you got burned for no reason. I'm sorry you've been stuck here all this time." The bone woman closed her eyes. For a moment, she looked peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered. The cold fire around her began to fade. The temperature in the room started to return to normal. The lights grew brighter. "Will you rest now?" I asked. She opened her eyes and looked at me. "I will try. But first you must keep your promises. Clear my name. Tell the truth. Honor the dead." "We will," I promised. The bone woman nodded once. Then she was gone, leaving only the smell of smoke and the memory of fire. The people of Raven's Roost kept their word. Within a week, the town council had passed a resolution officially acknowledging that Magdalena Thorne was innocent of all charges and was murdered by an unjust mob in 1878. They sent copies to the county courthouse, the State Historical Society, and the newspapers. The construction company donated money for a memorial stone, which we placed on the exact spot where Magdalena had been burned. Joseph Crow Feather came to bless the site with Cherokee prayers, and the local pastor held a Christian service for her soul. The inscription read, "Magdalena Thorne, 1855-1878, healer, midwife, innocent victim, murdered by fear and prejudice. May she finally rest in peace." Most of the supernatural activity stopped after that. People stopped seeing the bone woman. The strange fires went out. The livestock stopped dying. But I knew she was still there, watching. Sometimes when I walked past the memorial, I felt a presence. Not angry anymore, just watchful. Like she was making sure we remembered our promise. I stayed in Raven's Roost for another month, helping the affected people deal with the trauma of their experiences. Most recovered quickly once the hauntings stopped. A few, like Billy Morrison, needed ongoing counseling to deal with the fear. The cell tower was never built. The construction company decided the site was too unstable and moved their project to a different mountain. The half-finished foundation was filled in and turned into part of the memorial garden. As for me, the experience changed my career forever. I became interested in the psychological effects of historical trauma on communities. I wrote papers about the Raven's Roost case and consulted on similar situations in other small towns. I never saw the bone woman again after that night in the community center. But I dream about her sometimes. In my dreams, she looks different, not burned and skeletal, but young and healthy, the way she must have looked when she was alive. She always smiles and nods at me, like she's saying thank you. Sheriff Crowley started a program to research other historical injustices in the county. She found 3 more cases of people who had been wrongly accused and executed in the late 1800s. The county now requires historical and cultural surveys before any major construction projects. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, created an archive of documents about the Magdalena Thorne case. Students from the university come to study it as an example of how fear and prejudice can lead to tragedy. Harold Whitman moved away 6 months later. He said the mountains felt too crowded with ghosts. Betty Hawkins became one of the strongest advocates for the memorial garden and leads tours for visitors who come to learn about the case. I still visit Raven's Roost once a year, usually in October, around the anniversary of Magdalena's death. I bring fresh flowers for her memorial and spend some time in the peaceful garden that now surrounds it. The town has prospered since we laid her spirit to rest. New families have moved in. The old divisions between descendants and newcomers have mostly healed. Children play in the memorial garden without fear. But I always remember what I learned in those terrifying weeks. The dead don't rest when injustice is done. Truth matters, even when it's painful. And sometimes acknowledging The sins of the past is the only way to find peace in the present. The witch's backbone still rises above Raven's Roost, but it doesn't feel haunted anymore. It feels like hallowed ground, a place where truth was finally told, and a wrong was finally made right. Magdalena Thorne is at peace now, and so is the town that killed her. But I still check my locks at night, and I still feel watched when I walk alone on dark mountain roads, because I know now that some things are real, even when they seem impossible. And I know that the dead remember everything, especially the truth we'd rather forget. My name is Dr. Michael Ashford, and this is the story of how I learned that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it just takes a very long time to come. My name is Rebecca Hartwell, and I investigate ghosts for a living. I know how that sounds, like I'm some kind of fraud who takes money from desperate people. But I'm not. I'm a licensed paranormal investigator with a degree in psychology, and I've been doing this work for 7 years. Most of the time I help families understand that their haunted house just has old pipes or settling wood. Sometimes, though, I find something real. October in Virginia's Shenandoah Mountains is beautiful, but driving up the winding dirt road to the Ashworth estate, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The trees pressed close on both sides, their red and gold leaves blocking most of the afternoon sun. My husband Mark sat in the passenger seat, checking his equipment one more time. He's the technical guy on our team: cameras, recording devices, temperature sensors. If there's something supernatural happening, Mark's gadgets will catch it. GPS says we're almost there. My sister Jenny called from the back seat. She's our photographer and the biggest skeptic on the team. Jenny thinks most ghost stories are just people wanting attention. Our researcher Paul sat next to her, reading from a thick folder of documents. The Ashworth family died on October 15, 1932, Paul said, all 7 of them in one night, parents and 5 children, ages 6 to 16. How? Mark asked, not looking up from his equipment. That's the mystery. No signs of violence, no poison found, no disease. The neighbors found them 3 days later when smoke stopped coming from the chimney. I'd heard stories about this house my whole life. My grandmother grew up near here, and she used to tell me about the night the Ashworth family died. She was just a girl then, but she remembered the screaming that carried through the forest. Local people called it the mourning house because they claimed you could still hear children crying if you got too close. There it is, Jenny said, pointing ahead. The house rose out of the trees like something from a nightmare. It was bigger than I'd expected. 3 stories of dark wood and broken windows. Vines covered most of the walls, and the front porch sagged under the weight of fallen branches. But it wasn't falling apart. Someone had kept it standing all these years, even though no one lived there. We parked in the overgrown driveway and got our equipment. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No bird songs, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just quiet so complete it made my ears ring. Temperature's 68 degrees, Mark said, checking his instruments. Normal humidity, normal air pressure. Nothing unusual so far. But I could feel it already. That heavy sadness that clings to places where terrible things happened. It pressed against my chest like a weight, making it hard to breathe. I've been sensitive to spirits since I was a child, and this place was full of them. The Paranormal Research Foundation is paying us $5,000 to document whatever's in there, I reminded myself out loud. We set up our equipment, record for 72 hours, and write a report. Simple. Jenny laughed, but it sounded forced. Right. Simple. Just spend 3 days in a house where 7 people mysteriously died. They died almost 60 years ago, Paul said. Even if there were ghosts, they've probably moved on by now. I looked up at the broken windows and felt those invisible eyes watching us. Something about this place was different from other haunted locations I'd investigated. The sadness felt fresh, like the tragedy had happened yesterday instead of decades ago. And underneath it, I sensed something else, a desperate longing, like someone calling for help. "Let's get the equipment inside before it gets dark," I said. As we walked toward the front door, I heard it for the first time. Soft laughter drifting from somewhere inside the house. Children's laughter, happy and bright. Mark's equipment didn't pick it up, and the others didn't seem to notice. But I knew what I'd heard. The Ashworth children were still here, still waiting for someone to find them. The front door wasn't locked. It swung open with a creak that echoed through the empty rooms inside. The floorboards groaned under our feet as we stepped into what had once been a grand entrance hall. Dust particles danced in the beams of sunlight that managed to sneak through the dirty windows. "Definitely feels colder in here," Jenny said, rubbing her arms. Mark checked his thermometer. 52 degrees inside, 68 outside. That's a 16-degree drop with no obvious cause. We split up to explore the house and choose the best spots for our equipment. The first floor had a living room, kitchen, dining room, and what looked like a small library. Everything was covered in decades of dust and debris, but I could see that furniture was still arranged, as if the family had just stepped out for a moment. Children's toys were scattered on the living room floor. Wooden blocks, a torn rag doll, a toy train missing most of its cars. "Rebecca, come look at this," Paul called from the kitchen. He was standing by the old wood stove, pointing at the wall behind it. Someone had carved words into the wooden boards. "Mama, help us," in shaky letters that looked like a child's handwriting. "Could be from before the family died," Paul said. "Or someone could have done it later, trying to make the place seem more haunted." But I could feel the fear and desperation that had driven someone to carve those words. A child had done this, begging for help that never came. We spent the afternoon setting up cameras in every room and motion sensors in the hallways. Mark put his main recording station in the dining room, where he could monitor all the equipment at once. By evening, we had the house wired with enough technology to catch the slightest unusual activity. "If something supernatural happens here, we'll have proof," Mark said, proud of his setup. As darkness fell, the house seemed to change around us. The silence became deeper, more oppressive. The temperature kept dropping, even though there was no wind outside. And I started hearing things. Footsteps in rooms we'd just checked, doors closing somewhere upstairs, and always that sound of children laughing just at the edge of hearing. "Did you hear that?" I asked during dinner. We were eating sandwiches in the dining room, surrounded by Mark's blinking equipment. "Hear what?" Jenny said. "Laughter, children laughing." Mark checked his audio monitors. Nothing showing up on the recording devices. Could be wind through the broken windows upstairs. But I knew it wasn't wind. The laughter was getting closer, and it was definitely coming from inside the house. Around 10 o'clock, Paul was reading his research papers when he suddenly went pale. "Oh God, Rebecca, you need to see this." He handed me a police report from 1932. The neighbors who found the Ashworth family had reported something strange. All 7 bodies were arranged in a circle on the living room floor, holding hands. The parents were on one side, the children on the other. Their eyes were closed, and they looked peaceful, like they were sleeping. but they'd been dead for 3 days. "There's more," Paul said. "The coroner found something unusual. All the children had small marks on their necks like needle punctures, but he couldn't determine what caused them or if they were related to the deaths." Before I could respond, every piece of electronic equipment in the house started going crazy. Mark's cameras began switching on and off randomly. The motion sensors were beeping constantly. The temperature monitors showed impossible readings, some rooms registering below freezing while others showed over 90 degrees. "What the hell?" Mark scrambled to check his equipment, but everything seemed to be working normally. The malfunctions stopped as suddenly as they'd started. In the sudden quiet, we heard something that made us all freeze. Clear as day, coming from upstairs, we heard a child's voice calling, "Mama? Mama, where are you?" Jenny grabbed my arm. "Please tell me someone else heard that." We all had. Mark's equipment had recorded it too. A little girl's voice, scared and lonely, calling for her mother in a house where no living children had set foot in 60 years. "We should go upstairs," I said, though every instinct told me to run. "Are you insane?" Jenny whispered. "We should leave. Right now." But I couldn't leave. That child's voice had been so frightened, so desperate. If there really were spirits here, they'd been waiting alone in this house for decades. They deserved help, not abandonment. "I'm going up," I said. "You can stay here if you want." The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed to the second floor. The others followed reluctantly, Mark carrying his portable recorder. The upstairs hallway was lined with doors, bedrooms where the Ashworth children had once slept. The first room was small and clearly had belonged to a little girl. Pink wallpaper was peeling off the walls, and a tiny bed sat against one window. On the floor, arranged in a perfect circle, were 5 old dolls. "I didn't arrange those," I said, though no one had asked. "Neither did we," Paul whispered. As we stood there staring, one of the dolls slowly turned its head to look at us. Its painted eyes seemed alive, aware, accusing. Then, from somewhere in the darkness behind us, we heard the sound of running feet and children's laughter getting closer and closer. We ran back to the dining room and huddled around Mark's equipment, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The doll couldn't have moved by itself. Dolls don't turn their heads and stare at people, but Mark's camera had recorded it all. "Play it back," I said. The video showed us entering the room, showed the dolls arranged in their circle, and then nothing. The doll's head was already turned toward the door in the recording. It had never moved at all. "That's impossible," Jenny said. "We all saw it turn." "Maybe we saw what we expected to see," Paul suggested, but his voice shook. Power of suggestion, group hysteria. His explanation was interrupted by a loud bang from upstairs, like a door slamming. Then another, and another. It sounded like someone was going through every room on the second floor, slamming doors as hard as they could. Mark checked his motion sensors. Nothing. No movement detected anywhere in the house. The banging stopped, replaced by the sound of feet running down the stairs. Heavy adult footsteps, not a child's. They reached the first floor and kept going, heading toward us. We sat frozen as the footsteps entered the dining room. I felt a cold presence brush past me, so close it made my hair move. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Our breath came out in white puffs as whatever it was circled the table where we sat. Then the footsteps stopped, and we heard a man's voice, deep and angry. "Get out of my house." Every piece of equipment in the room went dead. All the lights, all the cameras, all the recording devices. We were left sitting in complete darkness with something invisible and furious sharing the room. Jenny started crying. "I want to leave. I want to go home right now." I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam showed our scared faces and empty chairs around the table, but I could still feel that presence watching us, waiting to see what we'd do. "We're not here to hurt anyone," I said out loud. "We're here to help. If there are spirits in this house, we want to understand what happened to you." The temperature rose slightly, and I heard a different voice, a woman's voice, sad and pleading. "Don't let him hurt them again. Please don't let him hurt my babies." "Who?" I asked. "Who's hurting the children?" But the presence was gone. Mark's equipment started working again. All the lights came back on, and the room felt normal. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "I heard the man's voice," Mark said. "The woman's voice. I'm not sure." Paul was frantically taking notes. The police report mentioned that neighbors heard arguing the night the family died, shouting and crying that went on for hours. Jenny wiped her eyes. "I don't care what the police report says. I'm sleeping in the car tonight." But I couldn't sleep at all. I lay on the couch in the living room, listening to the house around me. All night long, I heard children whispering to each other in rooms I couldn't find. I heard a woman crying somewhere upstairs. And sometimes I heard that angry man's voice, arguing with someone who never answered back. Near dawn, I dozed off and had the most vivid dream of my life. I was standing in this same living room, but it was clean and bright. A fire burned in the fireplace. 5 children sat on the floor playing with toys while their mother watched from a rocking chair near the window. The front door slammed open and a man stormed in. He was tall and thin with wild eyes and clothes that looked like he'd been working outside for days. The children scrambled to their feet, frightened. "It's spreading," the man said. "The sickness is spreading through the valley. The Johnson family is dead. The Millers are dead. It's coming for us next." The woman, Mrs. Ashworth, stood up slowly. "Thomas, you're scaring the children." "They should be scared," he shouted. "Do you want them to suffer like the Johnson children? Do you want to watch them waste away, burning with fever, begging for death?" "The children aren't sick," she said firmly. "Look at them. They're fine." But Thomas Ashworth wasn't listening. He pulled something from his coat, a small glass bottle filled with clear liquid. "I won't let them suffer," he said. "I won't let the sickness take them. I'll spare them that pain." The oldest boy, maybe 16, stepped in front of his siblings. "Papa, what are you doing?" "Something a loving father has to do," Thomas said, and I saw tears on his face. "Something merciful." I woke up gasping and found Jenny shaking my shoulder. "Rebecca, wake up. Something's wrong with the house." Sunlight streamed through the windows, but it felt wrong. Too bright, too warm, like it was coming from somewhere else. The furniture in the room had been rearranged during the night. All the chairs were pushed against the walls, and the children's toys were scattered in a perfect circle in the center of the floor. "How long was I asleep?" I asked. "About an hour," Jenny said. "But look at this." She led me to the kitchen, where words had appeared on the dusty floor. "He killed us," spelled out in a child's handwriting, and below that, in different handwriting, "to save us." I finally understood what had happened in this house 60 years ago. Thomas Ashworth hadn't been evil. He'd been terrified, driven mad by fear of a disease that was killing families throughout the valley. He'd convinced himself that poisoning his children was an act of love, a way to spare them from a horrible death. But the children didn't understand. They only knew that their father, The man who was supposed to protect them had murdered them. They'd been trapped here ever since, confused and afraid, not understanding why they couldn't find their mother or why their father had hurt them. "We have to help them," I told the others. "They don't know they're dead. They're still waiting for someone to explain what happened." That's when Jenny started acting strange. She was looking at the toys scattered on the floor with the expression of a much younger person. When she spoke, her voice was higher, more childlike. "I want my mama," she said. "Why won't Mama come when I call her?" Jenny wasn't Jenny anymore. She sat on the floor playing with the old toys like she was 6 years old instead of 27. When we tried to talk to her, she looked at us with a child's confusion and asked where her brothers and sisters were. "Something's taken over her," Mark said, his voice tight with panic. "We have to get her out of here." But when we tried to lead Jenny to the door, she became hysterical. "I can't leave," she cried. "Mama said never to leave the house. Papa will be angry." I knew what was happening. One of the Ashworth children had somehow connected with Jenny, was trying to use her to communicate with us. But it was dangerous. The longer it went on, the more Jenny might lose herself. Paul was digging through his research, looking for answers. "According to your grandmother's account, there was no epidemic," he said. "I checked historical records. No unusual deaths in this area in 1932. Thomas Ashworth made it all up." The pieces were falling into place. Thomas Ashworth had been mentally ill, probably schizophrenic or paranoid. He'd created an imaginary plague and murdered his family to save them from something that didn't exist. The children had died confused and terrified, not understanding why their father had hurt them. "But why are they still here?" Mark asked. "It's been 60 years. I looked at Jenny, who was now humming a lullaby in a little girl's voice. "Because they're still waiting for their parents to explain. They need to understand what happened before they can move on." That's when the temperature in the room dropped to freezing, and we heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. The angry presence was back. Thomas Ashworth, the father who'd destroyed his family. "You don't belong here," his voice boomed through the house. "This is my family. These are my children." The walls began to shake. Pictures fell off their hooks and crashed to the floor. The windows rattled in their frames like something huge was trying to get inside. "He doesn't want anyone to know the truth," I realized. "He's been keeping his children trapped here, making them believe the plague story." Through Jenny, the little girl's voice became desperate. "Is the sickness gone? Can we come out now? We've been hiding so long." I knelt down next to Jenny and took her hands. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Mary," she whispered. "I'm Mary Ashworth, and I'm 6 years old. Papa gave us medicine to keep us from getting sick, but it made us so sleepy. When will Mama wake up?" My heart broke. This child had been confused and alone for 60 years, not understanding that she was dead, still waiting for her mother to comfort her. "Mary," I said gently, "I need you to listen to me. The sickness your papa was afraid of, it wasn't real. There was no plague. Your papa was very sick in his mind, and he made a terrible mistake." The house erupted in rage. Thomas Ashworth's spirit lashed out, and furniture flew through the air. A chair missed my head by inches and smashed against the wall. "Silence!" his voice roared. "I saved them! I protected my children!" But I kept talking to Mary through Jenny. "Your papa thought he was protecting you, but there was nothing to protect you from. He was scared of something that wasn't real. You and your brothers and sisters didn't need to die." Jenny's face crumpled as Mary began to understand. Papa hurt us? On purpose?" "He thought he was helping," I said. But he was wrong. Very, very wrong. The house shook harder. Through the chaos, I heard other children's voices joining Mary's, her 4 siblings, finally understanding what their father had done to them. "We're not sick," one of them said. "We were never sick." "Papa lied to us," said another. Thomas Ashworth's presence grew stronger, more violent. Cold wind whipped through the rooms, and the lights flickered on and off. But I could also feel another presence, softer, warmer. Mrs. Ashworth was here too. "My babies," her voice whispered. "My poor babies. Mama's here now." Through the spiritual chaos, I watched Jenny's face change as Mary looked up and saw her mother for the first time in 60 years. "Mama!" Mary cried. "Mama, we were so scared. We waited and waited, but you wouldn't wake up." "I know, darling," Mrs. Ashworth's spirit said through the wind. "I'm sorry it took so long, but Mama's here now, and I'm going to take you somewhere safe." One by one, I felt the children's spirits gathering around their mother. The fear and confusion that had kept them trapped began to fade, replaced by the love and comfort they'd been desperately seeking. But Thomas Ashworth wasn't finished. His rage shook the entire house as he realized his children were slipping away from him. "No!" he screamed. "I won't let them go. I have to protect them." The final confrontation was between husband and wife, between the man who'd destroyed their family and the woman who died trying to save them. I could feel their spirits facing each other in that room, and I knew this was the moment that would determine whether the children found peace or remained trapped forever. "Thomas," Mrs. Ashworth said, and her voice was strong now, not afraid. "Let them go. You've hurt them enough." "I saved them," he insisted. "The sickness would have been worse." "There was no sickness, Thomas. There never was. You killed our children because you were sick, and you've kept them prisoners here for 60 years. Enough." The house fell silent. In that silence, I felt Thomas Ashworth's spirit finally understand the magnitude of what he'd done. His rage collapsed into grief and horror. "What have I done?" his voice whispered. "Oh God, what have I done to my children?" And then, through Jenny, Mary spoke one last time. "It's okay, Papa. We forgive you. But we want to go with Mama now." The change in the house was immediate and dramatic. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on us for 2 days lifted like fog in sunlight. The temperature returned to normal. The walls stopped shaking. Even the dust motes seemed to settle more gently in the morning light streaming through the windows. Jenny blinked and looked around like she was waking up from a long dream. "What happened?" she asked in her own voice. "I remember playing with toys, but why was I playing with toys?" "You helped a little girl who'd been lost for 60 years, I told her. She needed to borrow your voice to talk to her family." Mark was checking his equipment, amazed. Every device recorded the voices, the temperature changes, everything. "We have documentation of actual spirit communication and resolution. The Paranormal Research Foundation is going to flip when they see this." But I was more interested in what I felt than what we'd recorded. The house felt normal now. Just an old, empty building instead of a prison for trapped souls. The Ashworth family had finally found peace. We packed our equipment and prepared to leave, but Paul had one more surprise from his research. I found records showing that Thomas Ashworth had been treated for what they called nervous exhaustion several times before 1932. He'd been hospitalized twice for violent episodes. The family had been trying to manage his mental illness for years. It was a tragedy that reached beyond the supernatural. A man with untreated mental illness, a family trying to cope without understanding, and children who paid the ultimate price for their father's delusions. But now, at least, it was over. As we drove away from the mourning house, Jenny asked a question that had been bothering me too. Do you think they're really gone? The family, I mean. I looked back at the house last time. It looked smaller somehow, less intimidating. Just an old building that would probably fall down within a few years. Yes, I said. They're gone. They're together. And they're safe. Our case report became famous in paranormal research circles. The combination of historical documentation, electronic evidence, and successful spirit resolution made it a textbook example of how investigations should be conducted. We started getting calls from families all over the country who were dealing with child spirits in their homes. 6 months later, the Ashworth estate was sold to developers who planned to tear down the house and build vacation cabins. I drove out to watch them demolish it, curious to see how I'd feel. The wrecking ball swung through walls that had held secrets and sadness for almost a century. But I felt no distress from the destruction, no sense that we were disturbing anything sacred. The house was just wood and nails now, not a monument to tragedy. That night, I had one final dream about the Ashworth family. I saw them together in a place filled with golden light, Thomas and his wife, their 5 children playing nearby. He looked different, peaceful and healed from the mental illness that had destroyed their earthly lives. When he saw me watching, he nodded once, a gesture of gratitude and farewell. The mourning house is gone now, but the lesson remains. Sometimes the most frightening hauntings aren't about evil spirits or demonic forces. Sometimes they're about families torn apart by tragedy, love twisted into destruction, and children who just want someone to explain why they had to die. That's the kind of ghost story that stays with you long after the investigation ends. Not because it's terrifying, but because it's heartbreakingly human. My name is Rebecca Hartwell, and I help lost souls find their way home. The Ashworth family taught me that sometimes the living need as much healing as the dead, and that understanding the truth, no matter how painful, is the first step toward peace. I still investigate haunted places, but now I always ask the same question. What tragedy needs to be understood? What family needs to be reunited? What children are calling for their parents in the dark? Because every ghost has a story, and every story deserves to end with love instead of fear. My name is David Mackenzie, and I've been an Episcopal priest for 15 years. I've seen a lot of strange things in my time. People speaking in tongues, claims of miraculous healings, families torn apart by religious differences. But nothing prepared me for what I found in the mountains of Tennessee in the summer of 1985. The church sent me to investigate snake-handling cults in Appalachia. These groups believe that true Christians can handle poisonous snakes without being harmed, based on a verse from the Gospel of Mark. Most of the time, people get bitten and die. The church wanted a report on how dangerous these practices really were. I drove my old Ford pickup through winding mountain roads for 3 hours to reach Copperhead Hollow. The town wasn't much, maybe 200 people scattered across the valley. Old wooden houses clung to the hillsides like they might slide down any minute. The air smelled of pine and something else I couldn't place. Something sour. I met Deputy Sarah Collins at the local diner. She was in her early 30s, with short brown hair and tired eyes. She'd been dealing with complaints about the snake church for months. "Glad someone's finally taking this seriously," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. 3 people died this year, all ruled accidental, but their families think different. "What makes them suspicious?" I asked. Sarah looked around the empty diner and lowered her voice. "The bodies. Snake bites don't usually form patterns, you know, but these folks, The bite marks looked almost decorative, like someone arranged them. She pulled out a manila folder and showed me photographs. I wished she hadn't. The victims looked peaceful, almost happy, but their arms and necks were covered in small puncture wounds that formed strange designs. "The preacher is Joshua Thorne," Sarah continued. "Been here about 5 years. Real charismatic type. People love him, but he's got them doing things that would make your skin crawl." I studied the photos. "Have you attended any services?" "Once. That was enough." She shuddered. "David, I've been a cop for 10 years. I've seen car wrecks, domestic violence, drug overdoses. But watching those people handle those snakes, something ain't right about it." "Not right how?" "The snakes. They moved too smooth, too organized, like they were following orders." I closed the folder. Sarah was a rational person, but she looked genuinely scared. That worried me more than the photographs. "Where do they meet?" I asked. "Old church building up Snake Ridge Road. Used to be Methodist, but they abandoned it years ago. Thorne fixed it up. Services are Sunday morning and Wednesday night." I checked my watch. Tuesday afternoon. Perfect timing. That evening I drove past the church to get a look at it. The building sat alone on a hill, surrounded by thick woods. It was painted white once, but the paint was peeling now. The windows were covered with heavy curtains. Even from the road, I could hear singing, low, haunting melodies that seemed to echo off the mountains. I parked and walked closer. The singing stopped suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. For a moment, the silence was complete. Then I heard something else. A sound like dozens of things sliding across wooden floors. A curtain moved in one window. I saw a face looking out at me, pale with dark eyes that seemed too large. The face disappeared quickly. I got back in my truck and drove to the motel where I was staying. All night, I could hear that sliding sound in my dreams. Wednesday evening, I put on my best clothes and drove to the Church of the Sacred Serpent. About 30 cars were parked outside, more people than I expected in such a small town. I could hear singing again, but louder this time, with clapping and shouting. The front door was open. I walked in and took a seat in the back pew. The inside of the church had been changed completely. The walls were painted dark red, and symbols I didn't recognize were carved into the wooden beams. Candles burned everywhere, casting dancing shadows. The air was thick with incense and something else, a musky animal smell. About 80 people filled the pews. Men, women, children as young as 10. They all looked normal enough, farmers, shop owners, housewives. But they sang with an intensity that made my skin prickle. At the front of the church stood Joshua Thorne. He was tall and thin, maybe 40 years old, with long black hair and pale skin. When he smiled, his teeth looked too sharp. He wore a simple black suit, but something about him commanded attention. When he raised his hands, the singing stopped instantly. "Brothers and sisters," he said in a voice that carried easily through the church, "we have a visitor tonight." Every head turned to look at me. 80 pairs of eyes, all staring. I felt like a mouse in a room full of cats. "Welcome, Father Mackenzie," Thorne said. "Yes, I know who you are. Word travels fast in the mountains. You've come to judge our faith." I stood up, trying to look confident. "I've come to understand it." Thorne's smile widened. "Good. Understanding is the first step to belief. Tonight, you'll see the power of true faith." He walked to a wooden box beside the pulpit and opened it. Inside, I could see coiled shapes moving, snakes, at least a dozen of them. "These are our teachers," Thorne said, reaching into the box. "They show us what it means to trust completely. He pulled out a thick brown snake about 4 feet long. It should have been writhing, trying to escape. Instead, it hung calmly in his hands like a pet cat. "This is a timber rattlesnake," he announced. "One bite can kill a man in minutes. But for those with true faith, they are harmless as doves." The congregation murmured in agreement. I noticed several people had scars on their hands and arms, old bite marks. Thorn began to pray, holding the snake close to his face. The snake's tongue flicked out, almost touching his cheek. Then he passed it to a woman in the front row. She took it without hesitation, cradling it like a baby. More snakes came out of the box. Copperheads, water moccasins, rattlesnakes. The congregation passed them around like they were sharing hymnals. Children handled them. Elderly people let them coil around their necks. I watched, fascinated and horrified. These snakes should have been striking, biting, injecting their venom. Instead, they moved in slow, graceful patterns. Some seemed to be dancing to the rhythm of the prayers. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A young boy, maybe 12 years old, was holding a large copperhead. The snake raised its head and opened its mouth wide, showing its fangs. For a second, I thought it was going to strike. Instead, the boy leaned forward and kissed the snake's open mouth. The congregation cheered. The boy smiled and passed the snake to his mother. "This is impossible," I whispered to myself. Thorn heard me. "Impossible for those without faith, Father Mackenzie. But we have made a covenant. We give our devotion, and in return, we receive protection." The service continued for another hour. People spoke in languages I'd never heard. Some seemed to go into trances, their eyes rolling back in their heads. The snakes grew more active, slithering through the pews, coiling around arms and legs, but never striking. As the evening ended, Thorn approached me. Up close, his eyes looked almost yellow in the candlelight. "What did you think of our service, Father?" he asked. "I've never seen anything like it," I admitted. "Because there is nothing like it. We are unique, special, chosen." He placed a hand on my shoulder. His skin felt cold through my jacket. "You study religion, but we live it. You read about miracles, but we create them." "How?" I asked. His smile was unsettling. "Come back Sunday. Bring Deputy Collins if you'd like. You'll understand everything then." I left the church feeling dizzy. In my truck, I checked my arms for bite marks, even though no snake had touched me. The memory of those yellow eyes followed me all the way back to the motel. That night, I called my bishop to report what I'd seen. But how could I explain it? Trained snakes, defanged reptiles, some kind of trick? I knew what I'd witnessed was real. Those were genuine poisonous snakes, and those people should have died. But they didn't. Something was protecting them. The question was, what? I convinced Sarah to come with me to the Sunday service. She brought her service weapon, hidden under her jacket, and a small tape recorder. "If we're walking into something dangerous, I want evidence," she said. The Sunday crowd was bigger, maybe 120 people. The church felt different too. The air was thicker, harder to breathe. The candles seemed to burn with a redder flame. Thorn began the service with a long prayer in a language that hurt my ears to hear. The words seemed to twist in the air, making strange echoes. Several congregation members fell to their knees, trembling. "Today, we celebrate the summer solstice," Thorn announced, "the time when the veil between worlds grows thin. Our sacred friends will show us wonders." He opened not one box, but 5. Dozens of snakes poured out, more than I could count. They spread across the floor of the church like a living carpet. but instead of chaos there was perfect order. The snakes moved in patterns, forming circles and spirals. A woman in the front pew started speaking in tongues. She stood up, grabbed a rattlesnake from the floor, and bit into its neck. Blood ran down her chin, but she was smiling. The snake didn't fight back. It went limp in her hands, as if it had offered itself as a sacrifice. "My God," Sarah whispered beside me. More people began drinking snake blood. Children, adults, elderly members. Everyone participated. They passed the dead snakes around, taking turns to drink from the wounds. Some people cut their own arms and let snakes drink their blood in return. I felt sick, but I couldn't look away. This wasn't religion anymore. This was something else entirely. Thorn raised his arms, and the activity stopped. Brothers and sisters, we have fed our sacred family, and they have fed us. Now comes the true test. He walked to a young woman in the second row. She couldn't have been more than 20, with blonde hair and frightened eyes. "Rebecca has lost her faith," Thorn said sadly. "She tried to leave us. She went to the authorities." He looked directly at Sarah. "She told them lies about our community." The congregation hissed, actually hissed, like snakes. The sound filled the church. "Redemption is possible," Thorn continued, "but it requires sacrifice. Rebecca, will you prove your faith?" The girl was crying now. "Please, Joshua, I believe. I've always believed." "Then show us." Two men grabbed Rebecca by the arms and pulled her to the front of the church. Thorn picked up the largest snake I'd ever seen, a diamondback rattlesnake as thick as my arm. Unlike the other snakes, this one was clearly agitated. It coiled and struck at the air, its rattle buzzing like an angry insect. "This is our eldest brother," Thorn said. "He has served faithfully for many years. Rebecca, if your faith is pure, he will know. He will spare you." He held the snake toward her face. She tried to pull back, but the men held her firmly. "I can't," she sobbed. "Please, I can't." "Then you have chosen your path," Thorn said. He pressed the snake against her neck. It struck immediately, sinking its fangs deep into her throat. She screamed once, then went silent. Sarah was on her feet, reaching for her gun, but I grabbed her arm. "Don't," I whispered. "We're outnumbered. We'll end up like her." The congregation watched as Rebecca collapsed. The snake released her and slithered back to Thorn, who praised it, like a pet dog. Within minutes, Rebecca was dead. "Let this be a lesson," Thorn announced. "Doubt is poison. Fear is death. Only through absolute faith can we receive absolute protection." The service ended with more singing, but I barely heard it. All I could see was Rebecca's face, twisted in terror and pain. Sarah and I left quickly. In the parking lot, she was shaking. "That was murder," she said. "Cold-blooded murder. Can you prove it in court? Will anyone testify against him?" She looked back at the church, where people were still singing. They all saw it. They all participated. They all believe it was justified. "Sarah, we're not dealing with a crime here. We're dealing with something much worse." That afternoon, I drove to the county library and researched the history of Copperhead Hollow. What I found chilled me to the bone. There had been snake cults in these mountains for over 200 years. Always the same pattern: a charismatic leader, devoted followers, mysterious powers over venomous serpents, and always the same ending: mass death when the community turned against itself. The last one was in 1953. 47 people died in a single night, all from snake bites. The investigation was hushed up, but the newspaper archives told the story. Families destroyed, children found dead in ritual circles. The leader, a man named Ezra Thorn, Joshua's grandfather, disappeared, and was never found. I drove back to the motel as the sun was setting. In my room, I tried to call my bishop again, but the phone lines were down. The radio only played static. Even my watch had stopped working. Around midnight, I heard scratching at my door. Soft at first, then more insistent. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing but darkness. The scratching moved to the windows, then the walls. It sounded like dozens of claws dragging across wood and glass. I grabbed my Bible and started to pray. The scratching stopped immediately, but in the sudden silence, I heard something worse. Whispering voices, speaking that same twisted language I'd heard in church. They were calling my name. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair with my Bible on my lap, watching the windows, listening to the voices that circled my room until dawn. The next morning, Sarah was gone. Her patrol car was parked outside the sheriff's station, but she wasn't inside. The dispatcher said she'd gone out on a call around midnight and never returned. I knew where she was. I drove to the church, but it was empty. Then I remembered what Thorne had said about the summer solstice. They wouldn't be meeting in the church for the final ritual. They'd be somewhere more private, more sacred to them. I spent the day searching the mountains, following old logging roads and deer trails. Finally, just before sunset, I found them. There was a clearing deep in the woods, surrounded by ancient oak trees. In the center stood a stone altar that looked far older than any European settlement in these mountains. The entire congregation was there, maybe 150 people now, including children. Sarah was tied to the altar, unconscious but alive. I hid behind the trees and watched as Thorne prepared for the ceremony. Dozens of snakes had been arranged in precise patterns around the clearing, but these weren't the same snakes from the church. These were massive, prehistoric-looking creatures with scales that seemed to glow in the fading light. Thorne stood before the altar, in a robe decorated with serpent symbols. When he spoke, his voice carried impossible power. "Tonight, we complete the ancient covenant," he announced. "Tonight, our Lord rises to claim his rightful place." The congregation began to chant in that twisted language. The snakes responded, raising their heads and swaying in rhythm. The largest one, coiled beside the altar, was as thick as a tree trunk and had to be 20 feet long. "For 2 centuries, my family has served faithfully," Thorne continued. "We have fed him. We have worshipped him. We have given him our children, our blood, our souls. And in return, he has made us powerful." He pulled out a curved knife and held it above Sarah's chest. "This sacrifice will open the final door. The barrier between his realm and ours will fall. The age of the serpent will begin." I couldn't wait any longer. I broke from the trees and ran into the clearing, shouting prayers at the top of my lungs. The effect was immediate. The snakes recoiled as if burned. Several congregation members fell to their knees, screaming. Thorne spun around to face me, and I saw his true nature for the first time. His eyes were completely yellow now, with vertical pupils like a snake. His skin was covered in scales. When he opened his mouth, I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth and a forked tongue. "You," he hissed, "you dare interrupt the sacred ritual. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to release her," I shouted, holding my Bible like a weapon. Thorne laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your weak God has no power here, priest. This is sacred ground, serpent ground. Your prayers are meaningless." But he was wrong. As I continued to recite scripture, the giant snake beside the altar began to writhe in pain. The other serpents fled into the woods. Members of the congregation started to collapse, as if whatever was possessing them was being driven out. "Impossible," Thorn snarled. "I am eternal. I am power incarnate." "You're a liar and a murderer," I said, stepping closer. "And your master is nothing but a fallen angel with delusions of grandeur." Thorn raised the knife and lunged at me. I dodged and grabbed a burning torch from one of the stands around the altar. When I thrust it toward him, he screamed and fell back. "Fire," he gasped. "The old weakness. But it won't be enough, priest. Even if you destroy this body, I'll find another. I always do." He was right. I could feel the presence in the clearing, something ancient and hungry, looking for a new host. Several congregation members were standing up, their eyes beginning to turn yellow. But I had an idea. I grabbed the knife from where Thorn had dropped it and cut the ropes binding Sarah. She was weak but conscious. "Can you walk?" I asked. She nodded, struggling to her feet. "Then run. Get to your car and call for backup. Every law enforcement agency you can think of. What about you?" I looked at the altar, covered with carved serpent symbols. This wasn't just a place of worship. It was a prison. Something had been trapped here long ago, and Thorn's family had been serving as its jailers and feeders for generations. "I'm going to finish what someone started 200 years ago," I said. As Sarah stumbled toward the trees, I began to pray again. But this time, I wasn't trying to drive the entity away. I was trying to lock it back up. The ancient words of binding came to me, not from my theological training, but from somewhere deeper, as if God himself was speaking through me. Thorn realized what I was doing and tried to stop me, but every time he got close, the holy words drove him back. The remaining snakes attacked, but they couldn't penetrate the circle of protection my prayers had created. The entity fought back. I felt it pressing against my mind, trying to break my concentration. It showed me visions of power, of immortality, of dominion over life and death. All I had to do was stop praying and let it possess me instead. But I thought about Rebecca, dying in terror and pain. I thought about the children forced to handle deadly snakes. I thought about Sarah, nearly sacrificed on an altar to something that fed on human suffering. I kept praying. The binding took hold. With a sound like the world tearing apart, the entity was pulled back into whatever prison had held it before. The altar cracked down the middle, and the carved symbols began to burn without flame. Thorn gave one final scream and collapsed. When I checked his pulse, he was dead. But his face looked peaceful for the first time. The face of an old man finally freed from a terrible burden. Around the clearing, the congregation members were waking up as if from a long dream. Most of them had no memory of what they'd done. They looked around in confusion, saw the dead snakes and broken altar, and began to cry. The FBI arrived 3 days later, along with state police and social services workers. What they found was the largest case of mass cult manipulation in Tennessee history. Over 100 people had been under Thorn's influence, some for years. Most of the physical evidence was destroyed when the altar burned. But Sarah's testimony and my report were enough to start a full investigation. They found the bodies of 17 people buried around the clearing, victims who had lost faith over the years. The surviving cult members faced various charges, but most were given light sentences or probation. It was clear they'd been victims themselves, manipulated by something beyond their understanding. Sarah recovered fully from her ordeal, though she transferred to a different county. She said the mountains felt different now, quieter, cleaner. I knew what she meant. I stayed in Copperhead Hollow for another month, helping the community heal. We held regular church services in the old Methodist building after it was thoroughly blessed and the serpent symbols removed. Attendance was good. People seemed hungry for simple, honest faith after years of darkness. The Church of the Sacred Serpent was demolished. The clearing where the altar stood was declared a historical site and fenced off, though nothing grows there now. The soil is dead, salted by whatever presence had inhabited it. I returned to my regular parish with a new understanding of my calling. The church has asked me to investigate other cases of supernatural manipulation, and I've agreed. There are more places like Copperhead Hollow, more entities like the one Thorne served. Someone needs to stand against them. But I still wake up some nights, hearing that sliding sound in my dreams. And sometimes, when I'm driving through mountain country, I'll pass a small church or meeting hall and feel that familiar chill. The darkness is still out there, patient and hungry. It finds new servants, new ways to corrupt faith and twist devotion into something monstrous. Most people live their entire lives without encountering it directly. They're lucky. But for those of us who have seen it, who have felt its touch, there's no going back to ignorance. We stand guard. We watch. We pray. And when the serpents rise again, because they always do, we'll be ready. The war between light and darkness never ends. It just changes battlefields. And sometimes on quiet mountain roads where cell phones don't work and the old ways still hold power, that battlefield is closer than you think. Trust your instincts. Question charismatic leaders who promise easy answers. And remember, true faith doesn't require you to risk your life or the lives of your children to prove it. The serpents are always listening, always waiting for doubt to crack open a door. Don't give them the chance. My name is Tommy Briggs, and I've been going into dark places my whole life. First, it was the coal mines with my daddy and granddaddy, crawling through tunnels so narrow you had to turn your head sideways just to breathe. Then it was the caves, pulling out folks who got themselves lost or hurt in places they had no business being. That spring day in 1992, I was sitting in my truck outside the Mammoth Cave Ranger Station, watching the rain come down like God was mad at Kentucky. My radio crackled to life. Tommy, we got 5 college kids missing down in the deep system. Been 3 days now. I knew the voice. Sarah from Dispatch. She sounded worried, which wasn't like her. Sarah had seen everything these mountains could throw at people. Which section? I asked, though I was already reaching for my gear. The new passages they opened up last month, connected to the old Hartwell mine. My blood went cold. Granddaddy used to tell stories about the Hartwell mine, about why they sealed it up back in the 60s. Not because of cave-ins like the papers said, but because of what lived down there in the dark. I shook my head. Just old mountain stories. Had to be. 20 minutes later, I was standing with my rescue team at the cave entrance. Alice Chen was checking her medical supplies. She'd been a Navy medic before moving to Kentucky, and there wasn't anybody better at patching people up in tight spaces. Dr. Ray Foster was studying his geological maps, muttering about rock formations, and Jeb Murphy, our local guide, was staring at the cave mouth like it might bite him. "You sure about this, Jeb?" I asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jeb was third-generation mountain folk, knew these caves better than anyone. But today he kept fidgeting with his hat, wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's just that part of the system, Tommy. My granddaddy always said to stay away from those tunnels." "Why's that?" "Old Cherokee stories. Said something lived down there, something that wasn't quite human anymore." Alice snorted. "Come on, Jeb, we're scientists here." But I remembered my granddaddy's stories. how miners would go missing in the Hartwell tunnels, how they'd find bodies sometimes, all torn up like animals got to them. Except there weren't any animals down that deep. "Let's just focus on finding those kids," I said, clicking on my headlamp. "They're probably scared and cold, but they're alive. Has to be." The cave entrance was like a mouth, dark and wet. As we walked in, our lights carved out a small bubble of yellow in the endless black. The air smelled wrong, not just the usual cave smell of damp rock and bat droppings, but something else, something rotten. "Temperature's dropping fast," Dr. Foster said, checking his instruments. "And these readings don't make sense. It's like the rock itself is getting colder as we go deeper." We'd been walking for maybe an hour when Alice stopped dead in her tracks. "Do you guys hear that?" We all held our breath and listened. There it was, a sound like voices echoing from somewhere far below. But the echoes were wrong, bouncing off walls that shouldn't be there. "Hello," I shouted. "Can anyone hear us?" The voices stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, like something was listening to us now. Jeb grabbed my arm. "Tommy, maybe we should go back, get more help. Those kids have been down here 3 days, Jeb. They don't have time for us to go back." But as we kept walking deeper into the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond our lights, and that maybe Jeb's granddaddy had been right about staying away from these tunnels. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. We found their first camp about 2 hours in, down a passage so narrow we had to crawl on our bellies for 50 yards. Their gear was scattered everywhere, sleeping bags ripped open, food containers smashed against the cave walls. It looked like they'd left in a hurry. "This doesn't make sense," Alice said, kneeling by a torn backpack. "Look at these cuts. They're too clean for rocks, too deep for panic." She was right. The fabric looked like it had been sliced with something sharp, something with claws. Dr. Foster was running his hands along the cave walls, frowning at what he found. "Tommy, come look at this." The rock was covered in scratch marks, but they weren't random. They formed patterns, almost like writing, and they were deep. Whatever made them had to be incredibly strong. "Could be the kids," I said, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. These marks went all the way up to the ceiling, 12 feet high. "With what?" Alice asked. "Their fingernails?" "Tommy, these cuts go through solid limestone." Jeb was backing toward the tunnel entrance, his face pale in the lamplight. "We need to leave, now. We're not leaving without those kids." "Look around you," he hissed. "You think college kids did this? You think they tore up their own gear and then climbed walls like spiders to scratch up the ceiling?" I was about to answer when we heard it again. Those voices, but closer now. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, speaking words that almost sounded like English, but not quite. Dr. Foster pulled out his recorder. "Fascinating. The acoustics in here are impossible. Sound shouldn't carry like that." "Maybe we should listen to what they're saying," Alice whispered. We stood there in the dark, straining to hear. The voices were getting clearer, and I felt my blood turn to ice water, because now I could make out the words. "Help us. Please. So cold." "That's them," I said. "That's the kids." But Jeb was shaking his head. "No, no, Tommy. Listen closer." I did listen closer, and I realized the voices weren't coming from ahead of us, where the kids should be. They were coming from behind us, from the tunnel we'd just crawled through. Alice checked her compass. "This is impossible. We're heading north, but the voices are coming from the south passage." "Sound bounces in caves," Dr. Foster said, but he didn't sound convinced. "That's when we found the first body. It was wedged in a crack between two rocks, and at first I thought it was just more equipment. But when I shined my light on it, I saw the University of Louisville sweatshirt, and inside the sweatshirt was what was left of a person. Alice threw up. Even Dr. Foster turned away. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. The body had been eaten. There was no other word for it. Chunks of flesh were missing, and the bones looked like they'd been gnawed on. But it wasn't done by any animal I'd ever seen. The teeth marks were too big, too human-shaped. "We're calling this in," Alice said, wiping her mouth. "This is a crime scene now." I tried my radio, nothing but static. "No signal down here," I said. "We have to keep going. There might still be survivors." But even as I said it, I was thinking about those voices, about how they sounded almost right, but not quite. Like something was trying to copy human speech but couldn't get it perfect. Jeb wouldn't go any further. "My family's lived in these mountains for 6 generations, Tommy. We know things. There are places you don't go, things you don't disturb. This is one of those places." "What kind of things, Jeb?" He looked at the body, then back at me. "The kind that used to be people, long time ago. But they've been down in the dark so long, they've changed, adapted, and they're always hungry." Dr. Foster laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's scientifically impossible. Human beings can't survive underground indefinitely. There's no food source, no—" He stopped talking, because we could all hear it now. Footsteps, lots of them, coming from the darkness ahead. But they didn't sound quite right either. They were too light, too quick, like whatever was making them wasn't walking on the bottom of their feet. "Hide your lights," I whispered. We clicked off our lamps, and the darkness swallowed us whole. The footsteps kept coming, getting closer, and now we could hear something else, a clicking sound, like fingernails tapping on stone. In the absolute black, something moved past us. I felt the air stir, smelled that rotten smell stronger now. Whatever it was big enough to displace air as it moved, and it was hunting. We waited in the dark for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the footsteps finally faded, we turned our lights back on with shaking hands. "Did you see it?" Alice whispered. "See what?" But I had seen something, just a glimpse as our lights came back on. Something pale and wrong-shaped disappearing around a bend in the tunnel. We kept moving deeper, following the trail the college kids had left behind. More torn gear, more scratch marks on the walls, and something else, drag marks in the cave floor, like bodies being pulled along. The tunnels were changing too. The farther we went, the less they looked like natural caves, and the more they looked like something had been living here, digging here. The walls were smoother, worn down by countless hands and bodies moving through them. "These formations are impossible," Dr. Foster muttered, running his instruments along the walls. "It's like the rock has been shaped by something, but limestone doesn't work this way. It takes millions of years to—" He stopped talking because we'd reached a large chamber, and our lights were showing us something that made my stomach drop. Bones, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They covered the floor of the chamber like a carpet, some old and yellow, others still pink with meat clinging to them. And they weren't just from one time period. I could see everything from what looked like old Native American artifacts mixed in with modern hiking boots. "My God," Alice breathed. "How long has this been going on?" In the center of the bone pile was something that made it even worse. A crude altar made of stacked skulls, and arranged around it were fresh supplies, canned food, batteries, camping gear, like offerings. "The locals," Jeb said quietly. We've been feeding them." I spun around to look at him. What? Not me, but some families. They know. They've always known. Every few months, someone goes missing hiking in these mountains. Hunters, campers, kids who wander off. Most of the time, we figure they got lost or fell off a cliff, but some of us know the truth. You're saying people are deliberately feeding these things? I'm saying some people would rather lose a stranger every few months than have these creatures come up to the surface looking for food. Alice was examining the bones with her medical training. "Tommy, some of these show signs of healing. Broken bones that mended. These people were kept alive down here, for a while." That's when we heard the screaming. It was coming from deeper in the cave system, echoing off the walls until it sounded like a dozen people screaming at once. But I could pick out one voice, young, female, terrified. One of the college kids was still alive. "We have to go," I said. "Tommy, no." Jeb grabbed my arm. "That's what they want. They're using her as bait." But I was already moving, following the screams deeper into the mountain. Behind me, I could hear Alice and Dr. Foster following, and finally Jeb cursing as he caught up. The tunnels here were different. They branched off in all directions, forming a maze that seemed designed to confuse intruders. And the walls were covered in more of those scratch marks, but now I could see they weren't random at all. They were pictures, crude drawings showing the history of this place. People being dragged down from the surface, families of the creatures living in deeper chambers, and in the newest drawings, stick figures that looked like us, walking deeper into their territory. They'd been watching us since we entered the cave. The screaming stopped suddenly, leaving us in a silence that felt like death itself. "Which way?" Alice asked. The tunnel split into 3 directions. That's when Dr. Foster made his mistake. He'd been so fascinated by the cave formations that he'd wandered away from our group, following a side passage with his equipment. We heard him scream once, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly. When we ran to find him, all we found was his geological hammer and a blood trail leading deeper into the darkness. And carved fresh into the wall above the blood was a message in those same crude scratches. "Leave now, or join him." "They can write," Alice whispered. "Jesus Christ, they can write." But it was more than that. They could think, plan, and they'd just taken one of us to show they were serious. The footsteps started again, coming from all around us now. Not just from one direction, but from the tunnels ahead, behind, and above. They were surrounding us. In the beam of my flashlight, I caught my first clear look at one of them. It had been human once. You could tell from the basic shape, the way it walked upright. But generations of living in caves had changed it. The skin was white as bone and looked thin enough to see through. Its limbs were too long, too thin, like it had been stretched. And its eyes were huge and completely black, adapted for seeing in absolute darkness. When it saw my light hit it, it let out a sound that was part scream, part hiss. Then it scuttled up the wall like a spider and disappeared into a crack in the ceiling. "Did you see that?" Alice was hyperventilating. "Did you see how it moved?" But I was looking at something else. Behind where the creature had been standing, I could see a pile of fresh bones. And sitting on top of the pile, staring at us with eyes full of terror and madness, was one of the missing college students. She was alive. Barely. And she was the only one left. The girl's name was Sarah, and she'd been down in the caves for 4 days. What she told us, whispered through cracked lips and broken teeth, made me wish we'd listened to Jeb and turned back. They don't kill you right away, she said, rocking back and forth against the cave wall. They keep you alive. They farm you. Take pieces when they get hungry. Let you heal up, then take more. Her left arm was gone below the elbow, the wound crudely bandaged with strips torn from her shirt. But it was healing. They'd kept her alive long enough for the bone to start mending. The others? I asked, though I already knew. Mark lasted the longest. They took him this morning. He was still screaming when they... She started crying, a broken sound that echoed off the cave walls. Alice was checking Sarah's wounds, her face grim. We need to get her out of here. Now. She's got maybe hours before infection sets in. But when we tried to leave the chamber, we found our way blocked. They were standing in every tunnel entrance, dozens of them, maybe more. Their pale skin seemed to glow in our flashlight beams, and their black eyes watched us without blinking. The biggest one stepped forward. It had been human once, but that was a long time ago. Now it was something else entirely, 7 feet tall, with arms that hung down to its knees and fingers that ended in claws. When it spoke, its voice was like rocks grinding together. You come to our home. Jesus, Alice breathed. It can talk. We know you, Tommy. Briggs. The thing's head tilted at an impossible angle. Your grandfather knew us too. My blood froze. What did you say? He brought us gifts, food, we remember, the taste. And suddenly I understood. All those mining accidents in the old days, all those missing persons reports that never got solved. My own family had been feeding these things for generations. That's how you knew about them, I said to Jeb. Your family, my family, we've been part of this. Jeb nodded, tears running down his face. Every few months, we'd get word that someone was coming up here alone. A hiker, a researcher, someone who wouldn't be missed right away. And we'd guide them, make sure they took the wrong path. You bastard, Alice snarled. You led us down here on purpose. No, I was trying to keep them from coming up to town. Don't you understand? They used to come up to the surface to hunt. Back in the 1800s, whole families would disappear. The Cherokee knew that's why they avoided this area. But we made a deal. We keep them fed, they stay underground. The creature leader moved closer, its claws scraping against stone. Deal is broken. Not enough food. We are hungry. Time to hunt above again. That's when I understood what was really happening. The college kids hadn't just wandered into the wrong cave. They'd been driven here, herded like cattle. And we hadn't come to rescue them. We'd come to be the next meal. How many of you are there? Dr. Foster's voice came from somewhere in the darkness. He was still alive, but I couldn't see him. Many. We have children now, need more food. The creatures started moving closer, forming a circle around us. Their movements were coordinated, like a pack of wolves. But wolves didn't use tools, and I could see that some of them were carrying things. Sharp stones, pieces of metal, bones carved into knives. The water, Alice whispered. I can hear running water behind us. There might be another way out. She was right. Behind the pile of bones where we'd found Sarah, there was a crack in the cave wall, and cold air was coming through it. Air that smelled like rain and trees and everything good about the world above. When I say run, you take Sarah and go, I told Alice. I'll hold them off. Tommy, no, we stick together. But I was thinking about my granddaddy's stories, about all the people who'd been fed to these things over the years, about deals made in darkness that should never have been made at all. This ends now, I said, pulling out the emergency flares from my rescue pack. The creatures hissed when the red light flared up, covering their eyes and backing away. They'd lived in darkness so long that bright light hurt them. "Go!" I shouted, lighting another flare and throwing it at the largest creature. Alice grabbed Sarah under her good arm and started dragging her toward the crack in the wall. Jeb hesitated for a moment, then followed them. The creatures were screaming now, a sound like fingernails on glass. But they weren't retreating anymore. They were getting angry. I lit my last flare just as the first one reached me. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through my jacket like it was made of paper. But the flare burned its pale skin, and it stumbled back with a shriek of pain. Behind me, I could hear Alice and the others squeezing through the crack. The sound of running water was getting louder. Then the flare went out, and the darkness swallowed me. I woke up in a hospital bed in Bowling Green, with Alice sitting beside me reading a magazine. My chest was wrapped in bandages, and everything hurt. "How long?" I asked. 3 days. You've been in and out." She put down the magazine and looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Tommy, what do you remember about getting out?" I thought about it. The truth was, I didn't remember much after that last flare went out. Just running water, and Alice pulling me through a crack barely wide enough for a person, and then suddenly we were outside in the rain. "The cave flooded," she said. "All that spring rain we'd been having finally broke through. The whole system filled up in less than an hour. The creatures? Gone. Has to be. Nothing could survive that much water that fast." Sarah had been in the bed next to mine for the first day, Alice told me. Her arm was infected, but they managed to save her life. She'd been transferred to a psychiatric facility in Louisville. The doctors said she might never be right again. "What about Jeb?" Alice's face got hard. "The families up there held their own kind of justice. He's been asked to leave the area. Permanently." "And Dr. Foster?" "Never found the body. Officially, he was killed in the cave-in that caused the flooding." I lay back against the pillows, thinking about everything that had happened down in the dark. About deals made by people who thought they could control things that shouldn't exist. "Alice, do you think they're really gone?" She was quiet for a long time. "I don't know, Tommy, but I've been thinking about what that thing said. About having children. About needing more food. What are you getting at? Mammoth Cave is just one system. There are hundreds of unexplored caves in these mountains. If they've been down there for generations, breeding, adapting." She didn't need to finish the thought. I knew what she was saying. 2 weeks later, I was back at work, but everything had changed. I couldn't go into caves anymore without thinking about pale shapes moving in the darkness. And every time someone went missing in the mountains, which still happened, despite the official story about the cave-in, I wondered if we'd really solved the problem, or just moved it somewhere else. The locals don't talk about what happened. The official report blamed everything on a gas leak in the old mine that caused hallucinations, followed by a cave-in. The college kids were victims of a tragic accident. But sometimes late at night, I get calls from other cave rescue teams. Teams working in West Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina. They tell me about strange scratches on cave walls, about voices echoing from impossible directions, about equipment found torn apart like something was angry at the people who brought it underground. Last month, a family of 5 went missing while camping near Cherokee National Forest. They found their campsite torn apart, with drag marks leading to a cave entrance that was too narrow for people to fit through, but something had made it wider. I keep my rescue gear in my truck ready to go at a moment's notice, because I know the truth about what lives under these mountains. and I know that sealing off one cave system doesn't kill something that's been surviving in the dark for hundreds of years. It just makes it look for a new way to the surface. And next time, we might not have spring floods to save us. My name is Frank Kowalski, and I've been a Pennsylvania State Police detective for 18 years. I've seen plenty of bad things in my time. Murders, kidnappings, drug deals gone wrong. But nothing prepared me for what happened in the Appalachian Mountains during the winter of 1989. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in February. My captain called me into his office and handed me a file. "We've got a situation up in Crenshaw Valley," he said. 30 people missing, vanished overnight. I opened the file and saw photos of a small mountain town I'd never heard of. Snow-covered cabins, a tiny general store, and a white church with a tall steeple. "What kind of missing?" I asked. "The weird kind. Entire congregation of some church just disappeared. No signs of struggle, no bodies, nothing. Local sheriff requested help." The drive up to Crenshaw Valley took 3 hours on winding mountain roads. Snow was falling hard, and my car struggled on the steep climbs. The valley sat in a bowl between 2 mountains, connected to the outside world by just one narrow road. I could see why people might want to hide up there. Sheriff Beth Morrison met me at the tiny police station. She was about 40, with gray streaks in her brown hair and worry lines around her eyes. She'd lived in the valley her whole life, she told me, just like her parents and grandparents before her. "I'm glad you're here, Detective," she said, pouring me coffee from an old pot. "This thing has everyone spooked." She drove me to the church first. It was a simple building, white paint peeling in places, with wooden pews inside and a plain cross on the wall behind the altar. Everything looked normal except for one thing. It was completely empty of people, but all their stuff was still there. "Look at this," Sheriff Morrison said, pointing to the front pew. A woman's purse sat open, with keys and wallet still inside. In another pew, a man's coat was draped over the back, and a child's coloring book lay open on the seat. "They left everything," I said. "Even their cars are still in the parking lot. 30 people, Detective. Men, women, children. All gone." I walked around the church looking for clues. The doors weren't locked. No broken windows, no blood. It was like everyone had just stood up in the middle of service and walked away. "Tell me about this church," I said. Sheriff Morrison's face darkened. "Church of the Final Revelation. Started about 2 years ago when Reverend Stone came to town. Ezekiel Stone, he called himself. Charismatic fellow, drew people in with talk about the end times and salvation." "What kind of talk?" "The scary kind. Said demons were coming to earth, and only his followers would be saved. Got people to give him their money, their property. Some families lost their kids to him. We drove around the valley, and she showed me the empty houses. Doors standing open, meals half-eaten on tables, toys scattered in yards. It was like looking at a ghost town, except the ghosts had only been gone for 2 days. That evening I sat in my motel room going through the files. 30 missing people, including 8 children. No ransom demands, no threatening letters, just gone. But as I read deeper into the reports, I found something strange. This wasn't the first time people had disappeared from Crenshaw Valley. Sheriff Morrison had noted that back in 1847, an entire religious community had vanished from the exact same spot where the church now stood. 43 people, never found. And in 1923, another group had disappeared. 26 people that time. I closed the files and looked out my window at the church steeple in the distance. The wind was howling through the mountains, and snow was piling up against the glass. Something about this place felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. I'd been a detective long enough to know that most missing persons cases had simple explanations. People ran away from debt, bad marriages, or trouble with the law. But 30 people don't just vanish into thin air. As I fell asleep that night, I could hear the wind getting stronger. In my dreams, I heard voices calling from somewhere deep underground, but I couldn't make out the words. The next morning, Sheriff Morrison had news. "I found something," she said when I arrived at her office. My grandmother left some old papers in the attic, records from when her family first settled here. She spread yellow documents across her desk. Most were too faded to read, but one page was clear enough. It was a letter dated 1848, written by someone named Thomas Morrison, Beth's great-great-grandfather. "Listen to this," she said, and read aloud. "The Blackwood community is gone. All 43 souls vanished on the night of the winter solstice. We found their meeting place in the caves beneath Devil's Rock, but they were not there. Strange symbols carved into the walls, and a smell like sulfur that burned our eyes. The local Indians warn us never to disturb that place again. They call it cursed ground." "Devil's Rock?" I asked. "That's what they used to call the hill where the church sits now. The name got changed to Pleasant Hill sometime in the 1900s. We drove back to the church, and this time I looked more carefully at the ground around the building. Behind the church, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, I found what I was looking for. A hole in the hillside, covered by rotting wooden boards. "Cave entrance," I said. Sheriff Morrison helped me pull away the boards. Cool air flowed out, carrying a musty smell that made my nose wrinkle. I shined my flashlight into the opening and saw stone steps leading down into darkness. "We need to go down there," I said. "Detective, maybe we should call for backup first." "From where?" "The nearest state police barracks is 3 hours away, and this storm's getting worse. If those people are down there, they might not have much time." We went back to town for supplies, rope, more flashlights, first aid kit. The general store owner, an old man named Pete, watched us nervously. "You folks going down into them caves?" he asked. "You know about caves under the church?" Sheriff Morrison asked. Pete nodded. "My daddy told me stories. Said there's a whole maze of tunnels under this valley. Indians used to say they went all the way to the center of the earth." "Did your father ever go down there?" "Once, when he was a boy. Said he saw things that weren't natural. Came up white as a sheet and never spoke of it again." Back at the cave entrance, we tied one end of the rope to Sheriff Morrison's patrol car and lowered ourselves into the hole. The stone steps were old, really old, worn smooth by countless feet over many years. After about 50 steps, the passage opened into a larger tunnel. Our flashlight beams showed carved stone walls and a path that led deeper into the mountain. But the strangest thing was the temperature. It should have been warmer underground, but it was getting colder as we went deeper. "You feel that?" Sheriff Morrison whispered. I did. The air was so cold I could see my breath, and there was something else, a feeling like we were being watched. We followed the tunnel for what felt like hours. Sometimes it split into different paths, but we stayed on the main route, marking our way with chalk. The walls were covered with symbols I didn't recognize, circles and triangles and shapes that hurt to look at. Then we heard it, singing. Faint at first, like voices carried by wind, but as we moved deeper, it got clearer. Multiple voices singing something that wasn't quite a hymn. The melody was wrong somehow, like it was meant for different ears than ours. "That's them," Sheriff Morrison whispered. "That's got to be the missing people." We moved faster now, following the sound. The tunnel began to slope downward more steeply, and the carved symbols on the walls got more complex. Some of them seemed to move in the light from our flashlights, though I knew that was impossible. The singing stopped. We froze, listening. Nothing but the sound of our own breathing and water dripping somewhere in the darkness. "Hello?" I called out. "This is Pennsylvania State Police. Is anyone there?" My voice echoed back from the depths, but there was no other answer. We kept walking. After another 10 minutes, our flashlights picked up something ahead, a large opening in the tunnel wall. As we got closer, I could see it opened into a huge underground chamber. I've been in big caves before, but this was different. The ceiling was so high our lights couldn't reach it. The space felt bigger than a cathedral, and somewhere in that darkness, I could hear the sound of moving air, like breathing. "Detective?" Sheriff Morrison whispered, grabbing my arm. "Look." She pointed her flashlight at the floor of the chamber. In the circle of light, I could see bones. Lots of them. Human bones, scattered across the stone floor like leaves. And beyond the bones, deeper in the chamber, something else. The light caught the edge of what looked like an altar, a flat stone table surrounded by more of those carved symbols. That's when we heard the laughing. Not human laughing, something else. It echoed from all around us, coming from the walls themselves, low and rich and full of terrible joy. "We need to get out of here," Sheriff Morrison said, backing toward the tunnel entrance. But as we turned to leave, our flashlights caught something that made us both freeze. There, carved into the stone arch above the chamber entrance, were words in English. "Welcome to the Devil's Pulpit." And below that, in fresher carving, "Reverend Ezekiel Stone, 1989. We ran. Not walking fast, not hurrying. We ran like our lives depended on it. Behind us, that terrible laughter followed, echoing through the tunnels and seeming to come from the walls themselves. "The rope?" Sheriff Morrison gasped as we reached the entrance. "Where's the rope?" We looked up at the opening 50 feet above us. The rope was gone. "It was tied to my car," she said. "It can't just—" A sound came from deeper in the tunnels. Footsteps, heavy boots on stone getting closer. But there was something wrong with the rhythm. Too slow, like whatever was walking was dragging something behind it. I cupped my hands and shouted up through the opening, "Help! We're trapped down here." Nothing. No response from above, no sound of rescue coming. The footsteps were getting closer. Sheriff Morrison pulled out her service pistol, and I did the same. We aimed our flashlights and weapons back down the tunnel. "Who's there?" I yelled. "Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. Then, from the darkness, came a voice, deep and smooth, like honey poured over broken glass. "Detective Kowalski, Sheriff Morrison, welcome to my church." "Reverend Stone?" Sheriff Morrison called. "Where are the missing people? Where are the children?" Laughter again, but this time it was definitely coming from a human throat. "The children are safe, Sheriff. They're preparing for the greatest honor of their lives." A figure stepped into our light. It was a man in a black suit and white collar, tall and thin with dark hair and pale skin. But his eyes were wrong. They reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's eyes, and they were too bright in the darkness. "You're under arrest for kidnapping," I said, keeping my gun trained on him. "Where are the missing people?" "Missing?" Reverend Stone smiled, showing teeth that seemed too sharp. "They're not missing, Detective. They're found. For the first time in their lives, they're exactly where they belong. In a cave full of bones. in the presence of their true master. His smile widened. The same master who's been calling to this place for centuries. The same master who called to the Blackwood community and the others before them. Sheriff Morrison's voice was shaking. You're talking about the devil. Such a crude name. He has many names, many faces. But yes, Sheriff Morrison, your family has been fighting him for generations, haven't they? Your great-great-grandfather Thomas wrote such interesting letters about his encounters with my master's previous servants. How could you know about those letters? I know many things. I know that Detective Kowalski lost his faith after his daughter died in that car accident 5 years ago. I know that you, Sheriff Morrison, still pray to your grandmother's God every night, even though you're not sure he listens anymore. I felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature in the cave. How do you know about my daughter? My master knows all about loss, Detective. All about pain. He's been feeding on it in this valley for a very long time. The Reverend started walking toward us, and I noticed he didn't make any sound now. His boots should have been clicking on the stone, but there was nothing. Stay back, I warned, raising my gun. Bullets won't help you here, Detective. This is consecrated ground, but not to your God. Behind him, more figures appeared in the tunnel. Men and women in church clothes, walking in single file. But something was wrong with the way they moved. Too stiff, like puppets on strings. The missing people, Sheriff Morrison whispered. They were all there, the 30 missing congregation members. But their eyes were empty, staring straight ahead like they were sleepwalking. And they were all humming that same strange tune we'd heard before. They're alive, I said. Of course they're alive, Reverend Stone said. My master needs them alive. For now. What do you want with them? The same thing he's always wanted. Worship, service. And eventually, he paused, his 2 bright eyes fixed on mine. Sacrifice. The word hung in the air like a curse. The missing people continued their humming, getting closer. I could see children among them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8, a teenage boy with blank eyes. You're insane, Sheriff Morrison said. Am I? Tell me, Sheriff. In all your family's stories, did they ever mention what happens when the barrier between worlds grows thin? What happens during the longest nights of winter, when the old powers are strongest? I didn't like where this was going. What barrier? The barrier that keeps my master's full presence locked away from this world. For most of the year, he can only whisper through the cracks. But during the winter solstice, his smile grew wider. The barrier weakens, and with enough faithful servants, enough willing sacrifice, it can be broken completely. The winter solstice was 3 weeks ago, I pointed out. Ah, but Detective, time moves differently down here. In the deep places, in the old places, the solstice can last as long as my master needs it to. As he spoke, I noticed that our flashlight beams were getting dimmer. Not because the batteries were dying, but because the darkness seemed to be pushing back against the light. What happens if this barrier breaks? Sheriff Morrison asked. Reverend Stone's eyes gleamed. Then my master walks the earth again, as he did in the old days, and this valley, this whole world, becomes his kingdom. The missing people were only 20 feet away now, still humming. I could see their faces clearly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. They were smiling, all of them, wide, peaceful smiles like they'd found something wonderful, but their eyes were completely black. We need to get out of here, I muttered to Sheriff Morrison. How? The rope's gone, and they're between us and any other way out. Reverend Stone heard us. "There is no other way out, Sheriff. There's only one path now, down to the true church where my master waits." He raised his hand, and the missing people stopped humming. In the sudden silence, I could hear something else, a deep, rhythmic sound coming from deeper in the caves, like a massive heartbeat. "He's waking up," Reverend Stone whispered, his voice full of religious awe. "After so many years of sleeping, my master is finally waking up." The sound was getting louder, that deep, rhythmic pulsing from the depths of the cave. And with each pulse, I could feel something pushing at the edges of my mind, trying to get in. "Fight it," Sheriff Morrison whispered, grabbing my arm. "Don't listen to it." But it was hard not to listen. The sound wasn't just noise. It was calling to something deep inside me, promising things I didn't even know I wanted. Peace. An end to the pain I'd carried since my daughter died. A chance to see her again. "Lisa," I whispered, and immediately knew I'd made a mistake. Reverend Stone's eyes lit up with triumph. "Yes, Detective. She's down there with my master, waiting for you. All you have to do is walk down these steps and join her." I could see her now, standing behind the Reverend. My little girl, just like she'd been before the accident. 7 years old, pigtails, gap-toothed smile. She waved at me. "Daddy, come play with me." My gun hand started to lower. This was what I'd wanted for 5 years. Just one more chance to hold her, to tell her I was sorry I hadn't been there to protect her. "It's not real," Sheriff Morrison said, shaking me hard. "Frank, look at me. It's not real." But it looked real. Lisa was holding out her arms to me, just like she used to when I came home from work. And behind her, I could see other figures in the darkness, people I'd lost over the years. My father, my partner who'd been killed in the line of duty. "They're all waiting for you," Reverend Stone said softly. "Everyone you've ever loved. My master is generous to those who serve him willingly." I took a step toward the tunnel leading deeper into the cave. Sheriff Morrison grabbed me and slapped me hard across the face. "Snap out of it! That's not your daughter!" The sting of the slap cleared my head for a moment. I looked again at the little girl calling to me, and this time I saw the truth. Her eyes were black holes, just like the missing congregation members. And when she smiled, her teeth were too sharp. "Nice try," I said to Reverend Stone, raising my gun again. His face twisted with anger. "You will serve him willingly, or you will serve him in agony. The choice is yours." The missing people started walking toward us again, but now they weren't humming. They were speaking in unison, their voices blending into one horrible sound. "Join us! Join us! Join us!" "We can't fight 30 people," Sheriff Morrison said, "even if they are possessed or whatever." That's when I remembered something from my childhood. My grandmother had been a devout Catholic, and she'd told me stories about fighting evil, not with guns or violence, but with faith. I'd stopped believing after Lisa died. What kind of God would let an innocent child get killed by a drunk driver? But standing in that tunnel, surrounded by things that shouldn't exist, I found myself remembering the words my grandmother had taught me. "Our Father, who art in heaven," I began, my voice shaky. Reverend Stone hissed like a snake. "Your God has no power here." "Hallowed be thy name," Sheriff Morrison joined in. Apparently she remembered the prayer too. The missing people stopped walking. Their unified chanting faltered. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." Reverend Stone was backing away now, his pale face twisted with rage. "Stop! You don't understand what you're doing." "Give us this day our daily bread," we continued, and I felt strength flowing back into my voice. "And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. The missing people were holding their heads now, like they were in pain. Some of them were blinking, and their eyes were no longer completely black. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. At the word evil, Reverend Stone screamed. Not like a man, like something else. His face was changing, becoming longer and thinner. His fingers stretched into claws, and his teeth grew into fangs. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Light blazed through the tunnel, not from our flashlights, but from everywhere at once. Clean white light that burned away the shadows and the wrongness. In that light, I could see what Reverend Stone really was. Not human at all, but something ancient and twisted that had been wearing a human shape like a costume. It writhed and shrieked as the light touched it. The missing people collapsed to their knees, gasping and crying. Their eyes were normal again, filled with confusion and terror. "What happened to us?" a woman sobbed. "Where are we? Where are our children?" "It's okay," Sheriff Morrison said, moving to help them. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." But the thing that had been Reverend Stone wasn't finished. As the light faded, it pulled itself together into its human disguise again, though its eyes still glowed with inhuman rage. "You think one prayer can stop centuries of planning?" It snarled. "My master is already waking. The barrier weakens with every breath. Soon he will walk free, and your world will burn." From deep in the cave came that heartbeat sound again, louder now, and with it, a roar that shook dust from the ceiling and made my bones ache. "Something's coming," Sheriff Morrison said. "Something big." The thing wearing Reverend Stone's face smiled. "Yes, my master comes to finish what we started. And you, Detective Kowalski, will have the honor of being his first meal in the new world." Darkness began pouring out of the deep tunnel, like black water. Real darkness, the kind that swallowed light and made everything cold. As it flowed toward us, I could see shapes moving in it. Terrible shapes with too many arms and teeth and eyes. "Run," I said to Sheriff Morrison. "Get these people out of here." "What about you?" I looked at the wall of darkness creeping toward us and made my choice. "Someone needs to stop this thing. Get them to safety." She nodded and started herding the rescued people toward the entrance. But I could see the problem. We were still 50 feet below ground with no rope. How were 30 people going to climb out? That's when I heard it. Voices calling from above. Real voices this time. "State Police, is anyone down there?" "Here," I shouted. "We're here. Lower ropes." The cavalry had arrived. Sheriff Morrison must have called for backup before we went into the caves, and the storm had finally cleared enough for them to get through. But even as ropes dropped through the entrance and my fellow officers started pulling people up, the darkness kept coming. And in its depths, something enormous was taking shape. Something with eyes like burning coals and a voice like thunder. "I am awake," it said, and the words hit me like physical blows. "I am free, and I am hungry." I was the last one in the tunnel, facing down something that had probably been old when the world was young. My service weapon felt useless in my hands, but I kept it raised anyway. "Go back to sleep," I said. "This world doesn't belong to you." It laughed, and the sound cracked the stone walls. "This world has always belonged to me, mortal. Your kind are nothing but cattle, waiting to be slaughtered." The thing reached for me with claws the size of tree branches. I emptied my clip into it, knowing the bullets wouldn't help but needing to do something. Then Sheriff Morrison dropped back down on a rope, landing beside me with a heavy pack in her hands. "What are you doing?" I yelled. "I told you to get out." "My family's been fighting this thing for generations," she said, pulling sticks of dynamite from the pack. "My great-great-grandfather left instructions. If it ever woke up again, we were supposed to seal the cave." She lit the fuses with shaking hands. "This should bring down the whole tunnel system." The demon roared again, lunging toward us. We grabbed the rope and started climbing as fast as we could. Behind us, I could hear it tearing at the stone walls, trying to widen the tunnel enough to follow. We burst out of the cave entrance just as the dynamite exploded. The ground shook like an earthquake, and the hillside collapsed in on itself. Trees fell, and the church building cracked right down the middle. When the dust settled, there was nothing left but a pile of broken stone where the cave entrance had been. From somewhere deep below, we could hear muffled roaring, but it was getting fainter. "Is it dead?" I asked. Sheriff Morrison shook her head. "Not dead, just trapped again, at least for now." The official report said it was a cult kidnapping resolved by police intervention. The missing people were found suffering from drug-induced amnesia and exposure to extreme cold. Reverend Stone was listed as deceased, body lost in the cave collapse while trying to escape arrest. Most of the rescued people had no memory of what happened to them in the caves. The doctors said it was trauma-induced amnesia, and maybe that was for the best. A few remembered fragments, darkness, cold, and a voice calling to them from deep underground. But they were alive, and they were free. I stayed in Crenshaw Valley for another week, helping with the cleanup and the investigation. The church building was condemned and torn down. The valley was quiet again, with just the sound of wind through the mountains and normal human voices. But I knew it wasn't over. On my last night in town, Sheriff Morrison showed me more of her family's papers. Going back over 200 years, generation after generation of Morrisons had kept watch over this valley. They'd recorded every supernatural incident, every time the thing below had stirred in its prison. "It wakes up every 40 to 50 years, she explained. "Always during winter, always looking for servants to help it break free. My family's job has been to make sure that never happens." "What about this time? Did we actually stop it, or just postpone it?" She looked out the window at the collapsed hillside. "Both, I think. The cave system is destroyed, so it can't influence people as easily. But it's still down there, Detective. Still waiting." I thought about the moment in the tunnel when I'd seen my daughter. Even knowing it was fake, part of me had wanted to believe. That's how it worked. It found your deepest pain and offered to heal it for a price. "Will you stay here?" I asked. "Keep watching?" "Someone has to. My daughter's away at college now, but she knows the family history. When I get too old, she'll take over." I drove back to the city the next morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something unfinished. The case was closed on paper, but the truth was bigger and darker than any report could contain. 6 months later, I transferred to a new unit, one that specialized in cult crimes and ritual killings. Most of my colleagues thought these cases were just crazy people acting out fantasies. But I knew better. There were things in this world that science couldn't explain, things that hid in dark places and called to the broken and desperate. I kept in touch with Sheriff Morrison over the years. Every winter, she'd send me a brief report, all quiet in the valley. No strange disappearances, no unusual activity around the collapsed hillside. But she always ended her letters the same way. Still watching, still waiting. 5 years after the incident, I got a different kind of letter. Sheriff Morrison had died of a heart attack. Her daughter Sarah was taking over as both sheriff and guardian of the valley's secrets. I drove up for the funeral. The whole town turned out, though I suspected most of them didn't know the real reason Beth Morrison deserved their gratitude. As we stood in the cemetery, I looked up at the hillside where the church used to be. Grass had grown over the collapsed stone, and young trees were starting to take root. It looked peaceful, normal. But sometimes, late at night when the wind was just right, Sarah told me you could still hear something moving deep underground, something huge and angry and patient. "How long can stone and earth hold it?" I asked her. "Long enough, I hope. Long enough for the next generation to be ready." I still live in Pennsylvania, still work cases that deal with the supernatural. I've learned that Crenshaw Valley isn't the only place where old things sleep beneath the ground. There are thin spots all over the world, places where the barrier between our reality and something much darker grows weak. Most people go their whole lives without seeing behind the curtain. They read about strange disappearances in the newspaper, hear stories of cult activity, and assume it's all human madness. They're lucky. But for those of us who've seen the truth, who've looked into eyes that reflect no light and heard voices that speak impossible words, there's no going back to ignorance. We become watchers, guardians, keeping the vigil that others don't even know needs keeping. Sometimes I wonder if my daughter really is at peace, or if she's still trapped somewhere in the darkness, calling for her daddy to come save her. On the worst nights, I can almost hear her voice on the wind, but I've learned not to listen, because I know now that the greatest lies are the ones that offer us exactly what we want to hear. The thing under Crenshaw Valley is still down there, still dreaming, still waiting for someone foolish or desperate enough to dig too deep and let it whisper its promises again. And someday, despite all our watching and waiting and praying, someone will. When that day comes, I just hope there are still people like Beth Morrison's family around, people who remember the old stories and know that some doors should never be opened. Because in the end, that's all that stands between our world and the dark. Ordinary people doing an extraordinary job, keeping watch over places where nightmares are real and faith is the only weapon that works. My name is Frank Kowalski. I'm a Pennsylvania State Police detective, and I've seen the devil's pulpit.